Good evening all and welcome to day 2 of Cryptid Week. Tonight we're going to be heading into the deep woods for a chilling collection of Bigfoot scary stories. I'd like to give a shout out first though to Maltese Mike. I really hope that your treatment is going well and that you're fully recovered soon. Stay strong, my friend. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. A few days ago, my grandmother shared a story from her childhood that she had apparently kept mostly to herself for decades, and the way she told it made it clear to me that the memory still upsets her all these years later. So when she was around 8 years old, she lived with her sisters and parents in a very small house sitting alone in the middle of a wide open field. It was far removed from town and separated from neighbors by miles of farmland. The house stood isolated against the landscape, with thick clusters of trees lining the back portion of the property, forming a dark wooded barrier. A single narrow dirt road connected their home to the outside world, stretching out across the field in a long strip of pale earth that turned to mud whenever it rained, and made it difficult to travel during certain seasons. One night in May of 1964, after an ordinary evening, she and her sisters went to bed as they always did, sharing a small bedroom that barely fit their beds in a dresser. She told me she had been asleep for roughly 2 hours when she suddenly woke without understanding why, immediately overwhelmed by the intense sensation that someone or something was watching her from outside the room. Their bedroom had one small window positioned high on the wall, and sitting roughly 6 feet above the floor, which meant no one could casually glance inside without making a deliberate effort to reach it. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she slowly turned her head towards the window, and that was when she saw 2 glowing eyes staring directly at her from the other side of the glass. She described the eyes as bright and reflective, rather than softly illuminated, positioned high enough that whatever they belonged to would have been standing well above the height of an ordinary person. Fear gripped her instantly, and instead of screaming, she reached over and shook one of her sisters awake, whispering urgently for her to look towards the window. Her sister reacted immediately once she saw the same thing, pulling the blanket over her head in panic while trying not to cry loudly. The 2 of them lay frozen beneath their covers, hearts pounding, barely daring to breathe while those glowing eyes remained fixed on them through the darkness. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity stretched thin by fear, the eyes moved away from the window and disappeared from sight without an accompanying sound that might explain how something so large had approached or retreated. Neither of them slept for the rest of the night, instead waiting for morning light to push back the terror that had filled their room. When they told their mother what happened, she dismissed the story as imagination fueled by dreams and the natural fears of children living in such an isolated place. That disbelief lasted only until the family stepped outside to examine the ground beneath the bedroom window, where they found enormous footprints pressed deep into the soil, leading from the edge of the woods up into the house and back again. My grandmother said the prints were far larger than any boot her father owned, spaced in a way that suggested long strides and considerable height, and they sank deeply enough into the earth to imply significant weight. After seeing those tracks for herself, her mother no longer brushed off the story so easily, and from that day forward, my grandmother and her sisters were forbidden from playing anywhere near the tree line behind the house. A few months later, an unsettling detail added another layer to the memory when a neighbor who lived roughly 7 miles away mentioned that several of his cows had disappeared without explanation. He told them there had been no blood, no broken fencing, and no visible sign of struggle anywhere on his property, as though something powerful had simply lifted the animals and carried them off, leaving no evidence behind. Listening to her recount these events, I could see that even now, she has never settled comfortably on a logical explanation for what stood outside that window, or what left those massive tracks in the dirt. The isolation of the property, the reflective eyes at that height, the heavy footprints leading into the woods, and the missing livestock, all combine into something that feels far beyond coincidence. I think it was Bigfoot what she saw. But I'd like to hear if anyone else has an alternative explanation. This happened a few years ago at my parents' house in a small town in Wayne County. Anyone that knows the area knows some parts are very rural. Well, my parents live right in town, not far from the center of it, but in a weird spot. The town only has maybe 500 people in the town limit and is surrounded by farmland and forests. They live right near the railroad tracks and canal, and their backyard is pitch black at night because the street lights don't reach back there. The yard backs up to a walking trail and woods. It's actually pretty creepy back there after dark, even though it's 2 blocks from downtown. So the night this story takes place, it was extremely dark. I think it was a new moon or a moonless night, and it was overcast to boot. Late summer or early fall, so it was pretty dry, with no mud to capture any footprints. My parents, brother and I were talking in the living room at the front of the house, the part of the house facing the town and lights. Now the house is kind of long and skinny, maybe 40 feet wide by probably 150 feet long. And as we're talking, the family dog stood up, looked around, and started to growl really low. He was a yellow Labrador, about 90 pounds, half deaf and blind from diabetes, but overall still a pretty chill dog. He'd never bark at other dogs and very rarely barked at people, and that's what made this so odd. His hackles went up, and he started barking towards the back of the house. There were at least 2 closed doors before you even get to the room where the back door is. The dog is now like full-on berserk, barking at the closed door in the hallway. We open and follow it to see why he's going nuts. We get to the back door, and are now worried someone has broken in. But when we open it, Marley shot straight to the back door, jumping and barking and snarling, making sounds I've never seen or heard this big baby of a dog make before. As I open the final door for him to step out, he bolts. He was going to attack whatever or whoever was out there. Me and my parents step out onto the back porch and close Marley inside. He still sounds almost rabid. We wait a moment for our eyes to adjust, because the backyard is pitch black. Now we see a silhouette, maybe 50 feet away, standing at the edge of the yard, right near the railroad track access road. Now to say this thing was big is an understatement. It was way over 6 feet tall, probably closer to 8, and extremely broad. I'd think it was a potential burglar that we caught sneaking up to the house if it wasn't so absolutely massive. My parents to this day swear it was a black bear. Officially, according to the DEC, black bears don't live anywhere near this area and haven't for a long time. Also, the size of it would have been a record-sized bear. Also, the reaction of my dog going nuts doesn't seem like a bear would do that. After we had to put Marley inside, and it just sort of stood upright for about 2 minutes, before we decided it was best to go inside, as the hairs on the back of our necks were standing straight on end. The reason it freaked me out was, even at a distance, you could hear it breathe, these deep, raspy breaths. It sounded like it was breathing right next to my ear. They were slow and steady, not like someone who was out of breath. It wasn't like they were trying to make their breath sound loud, it simply was. I immediately went to find a flashlight, but when I got back outside, whatever it was had gone. There were no tracks or any fur. It was just a large silhouette that was simply too large to be a person, but acted unlike any wild animal I've ever encountered. This happened in March of 2018, when I moved from New York to Vermont and rented a house for a few months that allowed my cat and dog while waiting to close on my new home there. The winter brought particularly heavy snow that year, and the house sat up a small mountain dirt road where if 10 cars passed in any given day, I would count it as busy traffic. I booked it through Zillow, thinking it actually lay closer to the village, but planned to stay in anyway to heal up and rest and relax after an exhaustive packing and moving ordeal from the city. Some guy friends helped me get settled up there and left after one night, with warnings not to let my dog run loose off leash due to alpacas at the next door farm, about 1/8 of a mile walking distance away, though my aging dog moved slow at 16 years old and could barely walk anymore anyway. He ranked as one of those awesome, great dogs you get lucky to have once or twice in your life, since he got along with anything or anyone around him. The next neighbor lived at least a mile further down the road from that farm. I settled into the lovely one-story home, which featured automated motion detector lights up the driveway running behind the house, where a huge, ancient apple tree stood, with a few apples still high up, even in March, surrounded by the usual pine and birch trees across the property. Large front and back lawn areas spanned several acres surrounded by forests and old rock walls on all sides. I grew up in a New York area full of trees and forests, so felt no spookiness at first until that second night arrived. The house had a large pond out front covered in ice and snow, with at least 4 foot of accumulation on the ground and just enough driveway plowed for cars to access in and out. I backed my car close by the back door for convenience. Several outbuildings dotted the property as well. One open garage-like building sat perhaps 30 feet away from the back door and reached through the kitchen and served as a large garden storage area with no doors and just an open space exposed to the elements. Off the kitchen lay a screened-in porch facing the pond out front, which played a key role in later events. On that second night, I took my dog out on a leash at 8 p.m. when pitch black darkness was all I could see outside. Fresh, fluffy snow, about 1 foot deep, had fallen recently, and as a silly New Yorker, I wore sneakers without socks, a nightgown, and a light jacket, thinking I would stay out for only 5 minutes to let him do his business before bed. I walked him slowly across the snow until ready to head back inside. As I returned to the back door, I realized I had locked myself out by accident, since the doorknob twisted one way to lock automatically behind me. I tried not to panic in the cold, but stood there looking silly, with no flashlight or cell phone, and figured walking to the neighbors risked breaking an ankle in the dark over the unseen snow on the ground. I remember seeing a crowbar in that open garage building nearby, and thought I could pull a MacGyver move like those window break-in shows on television. So I took my dog's leash and tied it around my car's left mirror to secure him temporarily. I knew breaking in meant losing my deposit and paying for damages, but facing freezing temperatures outside, with no way even to enter the car for shelter alongside the dog, I grabbed the crowbar from the garage and after a little hesitancy, swung it hard at the glass window facing away from me. It bounced off, making the loudest, echoing sound through the night air, and even sparked on impact, which surprised me completely. What kind of window refused to break like that, since I counted as a strong person, able to handle physical tasks. Was this bulletproof or safety glass? I tried another window to the left, checking I could climb through if broken, but met the same unbreakable result again, so abandoned that approach for something else. That's when I recalled the screened-in porch off the kitchen. Then I figured if I reached the screened-in porch door leading outside, and if the inner kitchen door stayed unlocked, I need only rip a screen, which cost far less to repair than a full window replacement. I looked around and saw at least 15 feet of snow-packed path that required clearing to access the screen door, so returned to the garage for the shovel I'd spotted earlier. My hands and legs grew colder with every passing moment outside in the biting air. I shoveled as fast as possible to clear the path, while my dog barked loudly from around the corner, out of sight, since he could not see me working. His barks echoed off the back mountain beyond the forest in the yard, and I yelled at him repeatedly to quiet down until his noise suddenly stopped, which I dismissed as him calming, since I needed to focus on getting inside quickly. I finally reached the screen door and felt grateful it stayed unlocked, so squeezed through, pushing more snow aside to access the kitchen door, hoping it had not locked behind me, and found it open as well. Relief washed over me completely, so I ran through the kitchen to exit the back door again, where I locked out earlier, this time grabbing house keys first before stepping out. I checked the car mirror where I tied the leash and found my dog gone, with the leash hanging loose, looking torn or chewed through, which freaked me out further amid all the other troubles that night. I walked around the back of the house calling for him, and there sat my dog, happy, after doing his business, waddling slowly back towards me across the snow. Relief hit again as I tied the leash into a knot to reuse next day, since it came as a retractable type made for dogs over 100 pounds and measured at least an inch wide with thick material. How he managed to tear through that so quickly remains a mystery I still ponder often. I got to bed finally, vowing never to leave the house again without keys in hand, no matter the circumstance. The next night around 8 p.m, Bigfoot activity announced itself in the neighborhood clearly when I stepped out under a clear night sky, staring up at the stars in disbelief at their beauty after years in the light-polluted New York City. I saw constellations unseen for ages while standing at the back of the house in front of a large picture window overlooking the backyard, and a distant mountain with open garage at my 3 o'clock position to the right side. I stood there only 1 or 2 minutes when I heard a single car knock at the 2 o'clock position and another from the 11 o'clock spot relative to my stance. Those knocks sounded very much like the loud, clear bangs I made the previous night trying to break windows for entry, echoing distantly through the still air. I knew the sound of trees swaying well from experience, but no wind blew that night, and trees stayed motionless, so the noise came deliberately and sharp. But from where? I hightailed it back inside the house in seconds flat, and locked all the doors securely behind me. The following night, I thought things stayed normal enough, but events escalated further during the usual routine of walking the dog down the driveway a short distance with all outside lights turned on, since ice covered the ground and I used a ski pole for safe walking, alongside a flashlight while keeping house keys in my jacket pocket always. I started back towards the kitchen door. I glanced beyond the open garage outbuilding because a pop of color caught my eye suddenly. A pair of really large red eyes stared back at me from the edge where the yard edged against a rock wall abutting the dark forest beyond. At first I wondered if an owl caused the glow, but shifted left to right, testing for reflection from house lights, which seemed a good explanation at that moment. Those eyes stayed fixed, however, big red-orange orbs, watching me directly with spacing so wide apart they unnerved me deeply. The distance measured about 100 to 120 feet from my position. Those eyes appeared at least 10 inches apart, suggesting a massive head size I preferred not to imagine fully. I stood frozen for at least a minute, waiting for movement to identify the source until incomprehension hit, and I scurried back inside the house fast, closing the doors tight. The next day I checked the area carefully in daylight, venturing out into the deep snow about 30 feet to search for reflected tin cans or anything explaining the glow from the previous night. I saw absolutely nothing unusual there at all. I grabbed binoculars from inside the house and returned for another look, but found only the rock wall forest edge and birds chirping happily in the trees. I stayed at the rental 3 or 4 more weeks after that without seeing those eyes or any reflection again during remaining nights. This marked not my first possible Bigfoot encounter, since 2 others occurred back in New York State previously. The final kicker came later, when I realized a spare key hung right above the shovel I grabbed that first night, which would have let me back in immediately without all the drama. I received my full security deposit back regardless, and adored the house overall, despite events, though my MacGyver attempts ended for good after that ordeal. I grew up in the great Pacific Northwest, in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains, under the shadow of Mount St. Helens in Washington State. It's a land full of myth and legend, mostly from the natives, but a lot of the old-timers, loggers and trappers and hunters, etc., have stories of their own. One of my father's oldest and dearest friends, now passed on, was a local Native American who was one of the oldest of his nation. He was an adult before most of the towns in our area were settled by white people, and his name to us was Charlie. I'm sure he had another native name, but I don't recall what it was. Charlie used to sit us down, kids and adults, and tell us stories. Some of the stories were tribal legends, some of them were things he swore happened to him in the woods, and some of them, he said, were things that other men and women of his tribe or fur trappers and miners in the late 19th century experienced. As I got older, I began to realize that Charlie wasn't just pulling our legs on some of these stories. He genuinely believed them, and a few of them happened to me as I would wander out in the woods and investigate. The most obvious and easiest to prove was the ridge lights or mountain lights. Charlie called them a different name, and locals to this day still tell stories about them. The lights, according to Charlie, had existed as far back as man had. They would appear around the mountains on clear nights and zip around in the air. One of the local legends said the lights were the spirits dancing and playing. I first saw the lights when I was a kid, and several times since then. To me it fits the exact description of a classic UFO, lights that appear to be some form of aircraft that flew in manners impossible for current aircrafts, incredible speeds and course corrections. The last time I saw the ridge lights were in the mid-90s. I have noticed a distinct decrease in reported sightings of them since then as well, but for a while the western foothills of the Cascades were a hotspot for UFO sightings. Speaking of UFOs, it goes a bit further than just seeing lights. When I was a young kid, I woke up in the middle of the night in the little farmhouse we lived in to bright lights outside. They were multicolored and flashing like police car lights, except I seem to recall there was green in there as well. I was curiously unafraid and walked out of my room into the living room, the kitchen, and eventually my parents' room. All the while, in all the windows, there were these bright lights. I tried to wake my parents up, but they were sound asleep. I shrugged it off, went to bed, and woke up in the morning, When I brought it up to my parents, they dismissed it as a dream. I accepted that, especially because one of the odd parts of my story, I couldn't wake up my father, and he was a Vietnam vet who normally woke up at the sound of a mosquito farting. This story would have ended there, if not for our drunken neighbor. Some years later, when I was a teen, I was talking with the now dead neighbor's granddaughter. The neighbor himself was known as a drunken lout and storyteller of the first order. His granddaughter was telling me about how he used to tell these crazy stories, and one day he swore up and down that aliens landed in his field and visited him in the middle of the night. I laughed and said I think I would have seen that, as our yard is connected to his field. She agreed, said something like, "You and your parents would have noticed a bunch of red, green and blue and white flashing lights in your backyard 10 years ago." To be clear, I'm not saying I saw a UFO land in my house. I am saying I might have seen lights that match that description of lights on the supposed spaceship reported to have landed in my unreliable drunken neighbor's yard. And then there's the biggest myth of all. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you call him. Do I believe he exists? Absolutely. Even though I consider myself a man who puts science before superstition, why do I believe in him? Because when I was a child, I saw the footprints. My father even has a plaster cast of one. That was my first encounter. The prints were on the edge of a creek bed in a small ravine, on a piece of wild property my father owned. We found them while surveying the property with a hunter friend. My father insisted it must have been Bigfoot, to which the hunter scoffed and said a man could have made those footprints. To demonstrate, this 6'6", 250-pound hunter climbed on a nearby log, took off his boots, and jumped down into the semi-soft ground. His size 12 feet didn't even make half the indent in the earth next to the other print. The other print was a hand longer than the hunter's, and at least 1.5 inches down. It also had an odd big toe. It was splayed to the side, kind of like a thumb. My dad consulted Charlie for advice. Charlie told him to leave Sasquatch be, and Sasquatch would leave us be. Charlie also told us how to know when Sasquatch was nearby. Nothing else would be, and sometimes you could smell him. He said if you could smell Sasquatch, it was time to get the hell out, because he was a hell of a lot closer than you wanted him to be. As the years went by, we learned to just hike out of the woods if they got dead quiet, and we didn't see signs of any other animals. Only twice do I think I smelled him. Both times it was a heavy, musty, almost moldy odor, like old sweat or wet dog. The second time I was with a girlfriend, and this was in my teen years, and I recalled something else Charlie had said. Never go into Sasquatch territory with a woman who was on her period, because he could smell that and would track her, according to legend, to find a mate. It was the first time I ever asked a girl if she was on her period. She was. Needless to say, quite embarrassed to answer that it was her time of the month. That's when I told her we needed to leave now, and we started out of the woods. We both swore we heard sticks breaking and branches rustling behind us the entire way out, and we both had that terrifying pit in your stomach you get when you know something is watching you. My mum was a teenager at the lake with her family when the incident happened. She reached around 17 years of age at the time. Her brother followed 2 years younger in the group. Their 2 cousins joined them for a campground outing, as well as 2 Saint Bernards accompanying the humans on the walk. They followed a paved path through the campground area that day. The dogs suddenly started losing control and tried to run back along the path. That direction pointed opposite from the cabin where they stayed. The dogs refused to leave my mum and uncle behind in the process. They walked off leashes during the entire trip there. One dog grabbed my mum's shorts in its teeth and pulled her backwards steadily. The behavior resembled a scene pulled straight from a bad comedy movie. Both dogs showed extreme loyalty and protectiveness towards my family, and they remained chill and friendly during most situations around people. The entire group stood around watching the dogs act out in strange ways. Laughter broke out among them at first. No one grasped what was causing the disturbance at the moment, and my mum said they all looked up at the exact same moment together, because one of the dogs started to whimper and cowered down low from apparent terror. All 4 humans turned their head to the trees on the right side of the trailhead, and there, in plain view among the branches, was a creature that was standing maybe 8 feet away from them. My mum guessed its height fell between 8 and 10 feet overall. Dusk approached the area, but full darkness hadn't arrived yet, and at that point, all 4 witnesses remained adamant about the sighting to this day. The figure matched nothing like a bear in shape or movement. No other animal fit the description they observed closely, except perhaps Bigfoot. The creature stared directly at them from just inside the tree-line edge. It crouched low when they locked eyes on it directly. My mum described the motion like a person trying to greet a shy dog from afar. The moment lasted only briefly in real time, before change occurred. The creature straightened up to full height once more. It crossed the path slowly into the trees on the other side of the trail, and it kept eyeballing them the entire way without breaking its gaze. My mum noted no antagonistic or threatening vibes from the posture. The presence felt wary and almost forced casual demeanor instead. That casual air failed to stop the raw terror that gripped my mum and the others completely. They unfroze from the shock after a few moments passed, and they coaxed the dogs to move forward along the path again. The group booked it back to the cabin as fast as their legs allowed them. They told everyone waiting there about the encounters in detail. Some uncles and her other brother and another cousin went out to investigate the area later, but the dogs absolutely refused to approach that path again under any coaxing. The animals freaked out whenever my mum or her siblings headed in that direction, and this reaction lasted for the rest of the weekend without fail. Now, my mum is an extremely rational person in all matters of life. She avoids belief in supernatural things generally across the board, and never exaggerates details or bends the truth in any accounts shared. No one carries more trust for a first-hand story like this one from her directly. My dad provided the next account from about 15 years ago in the woods. He hunted alone in one of his usual areas, as typical for him during those trips. The spot sat 4 miles in from the logging road where he parked his truck in the morning. The sun had just barely risen above the horizon line when he started out on foot. He headed towards a creek used as the central starting point for hunting in that area often. He wandered around the terrain looking for signs of game animal present, and he found absolutely nothing recent in the surrounding woods at all. That scarcity proved very unusual for those specific woods known for activity, and that is when he heard the most terrifying noise he had ever encountered up until that point in his life. The sound came multi-tonal through the trees, as if 2 or 3 voices screamed in disharmonic unison together. The pitches varied across the range, but rose and fell in sync perfectly. They started and ended in the exact same moments without stagger. He would have thought several different voices made it otherwise from the complexity, and every hair on his body stood on end from the noise piercing the air. A horrifying feeling of dread overcame him completely in that instant. The individual pitches sounded rather human-like to his trained ears immediately. The scream lasted longer than any human lungs could sustain without break. He estimated over a minute for the full duration of it. The sound did not pause at any point during its length. It never repeated after ending abruptly in silence. The reverberation suggested it came from very far away through the ridges. The ear-splitting volume made that distance seem impossible to reconcile. He decided to leave the area immediately after that sound stopped echoing. The noise originated from the same general direction as his truck, parked back along the road. He rationalized facing a beast over getting lost in the opposite direction from there. Part of him worried it signaled an animal in pain or suffering nearby, but he could not stand that possibility without action being taken. He planned to help or end its misery if he came across it directly. He told himself a hunting cry meant the maker sprinted elsewhere away fast. His rifle would stop a head-on collision if it happened unexpectedly, and he headed back towards the truck at a full sprint through the brush, and he moved noisily on purpose to make his presence known. Anything out there already detected his position anyway from earlier. He carried his rifle ready in hand rather than slung on his back as usual, and a round sat chambered in the barrel with the safety switched off. Gun safety ranked highest for his normally in all situations. He advocated it stronger than anyone else around me, in fact. About a mile from the vehicle, he reached an area that smelled horrible beyond words. The stench mixed garbage and decay with other foul notes altogether. He covered his nose with his shirt sleeve to pass through it quickly. A pile of extremely fresh deer guts appeared in the open, clearing area. The source failed to match the smell exactly from a distance. 2 animals' worth of guts and legs sat in a neat pile arranged. The legs looked almost torn off rather than cut clean with tools. No heads, carcasses, or pelts showed nearby. Blood smeared around the area without a typical puddle from the bleeding out process. He looked around for a while to check for poaching evidence present. His passion as an anti-poacher drove the inspection forward carefully. His brain clicked to the conclusion that he had interrupted Bigfoot with his lunch. He booked it out of there to the truck without further delay or pause. He kept his pack on until clear of the mountain entirely, and he refused to buckle up until off-road and driving away. He told my brother and me this story when we got home from school that day without a mission. I felt baffled, since I had never, since that day, seen my dad afraid before. I live in North Texas, near a large wildlife refuge and a lake bigger than my hometown. One night I decided to go down the long gravel road to the dock with a female friend of mine. I usually carry a gun. I left my pistol locked in the glove box by the gate, and the road stretched out about 200 yards to the dock. About 30 yards into the trek I heard a noise on my left. The earth growled and rumbled, and I looked around to pinpoint the sound, but saw nothing. We stood still waiting for it to resume. We heard heavy footsteps instead. The paces moved without crashing or rustling, and I turned to my friend and asked if she wanted to go back. She did not know. We continued to the dock with the growling and rumbling following us. Heavy paces accompanied the sound. I reached for my right hip and was met with a blank space where my holster should have been. I'd left my pistol in the glove box. I grabbed my pocket knife and palmed it, and the rumbling continued. It impacted the air with its weight, and we quickened our pace. It matched ours but stayed in the wood, and this went on for about 300 yards, until I arrived to the dock. Bear in mind, I have hunted and camped since I was 6, and I've never heard a sound like this before. My friend sprinted to the edge of the dock. I grabbed rocks and sat beside her, and for 15 minutes it circled the area around the dock landing. Rumbles and growls emanated from 30 to 40 yards away, but darkness obscured it. I had no firearm, and we couldn't see what it was. and I called my buddy Dennis, who lived 5 minutes away, while the rumbling and pacing continued. It did not step onto the dock. Headlights appeared over the trees, and the rumbling then faded into the darkness, and Dennis walked down cradling a rifle, and that ended the incident. Deer and hogs roamed the trails there. I walked those paths many times alone. The gravel road cut through the thickest wood section. My friend stayed close as we walked that night. The growl first sounded like distant thunder. The rumble built from underground vibrations, and the footsteps followed perfectly in rhythm. We covered the full length to the dock, and the knife felt small in my hands. Rocks lay scattered along the water's edge. The circling pattern held steady for 15 minutes. The incident left me unsettled for months. I thought about it every night after. Cryptozoology made sense after that experience. Local cultures tell stories of similar creatures. My brother-in-law went hunting in the hill country outside Austin when he was a teenager. He positioned himself to watch an area for deer in the early morning. Darkness still covered the landscape when he settled into place. A clearing lay ahead with several large rocks scattered across the ground. Silhouettes defined the shapes in the low light, and he waited motionless with his rifle ready across his lap. The air stayed cool and still as dawn approached slowly from the east. He scanned the clearing through his scope at regular intervals. Shadows blended the rocks into the terrain without distinct edges, but one shape sat apart from the others near the tree line. He marked it as a boulder that was too heavy to shift without machinery, and minutes passed while he kept his focus on distant movement among the oaks. Well, at some point, he lowered the scope to rest his eyes, and that's when he looked back across the clearing with naked vision. One of the rocks stood upright from its position. The shape rose smoothly to full height. It turned away from him towards the woods. Heavy steps carried it into the underbrush. Leaves shifted slightly from the passages, yet no branches could be heard breaking under its weight. He froze in place behind his cover. His breath caught short in his throat from the sight. The figure matched no animal he knew from those in the hills. Deer bolted from cover when startled in open grounds. Hogs rooted loudly through brush with tusks gleaming, and this form walked upright on 2 legs alone. Broad shoulders filled the silhouette against the fading dark. He watched until the trees swallowed the shape completely from view, and silence returned to the clearing after the steps had faded. There were no calls echoing from birds or coyotes, and sunlight crept over the ridge. The spot where the rock was stood empty now. Bare earth showed no prints or disturbance in the dirt, and he stayed there for a solid hour before moving. He gathered his gear and hiked back to the truck parked down the trail, his hands shaking on the steering wheel on the drive home. He told no one about the events for several days. Words failed to describe the motion he witnessed firsthand. Some friends laughed when he finally spoke about his account. He insisted, though, that the shape walked away from him, like it knew he was there. To this day, my brother-in-law believes he saw a Sasquatch in those hills. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I do hope you have enjoyed tonight's collection of Bigfoot stories, and if of course you did, you can show me some love in the comments section below. Of course, it is always very much appreciated. I would also like to give an extra special thanks to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen for all their continued help and support and help keep the channel running. And if you'd like some exclusive perks that you can only get from Patreon, follow the links to find out more. But that's it from me, guys. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.
Mortis.
Good evening all and welcome to day 4 of Cryptid Week. I have a thrilling collection of cryptid stories for you to enjoy tonight. Before we begin though, I would like to gently remind everyone that YouTube is putting a lot of focus and energy on shorts right now. So if you want to keep supporting your long form creator friends like me, your sub and bell icon and a odd like here and there would go a hell of a long way to keep us running. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. This all happened in Hungary back in 2002, out in the middle of Eastern Europe. My father spent most of his life deep in the forests around our home, a passion that started when he was just a small boy wandering off on his own. According to my grandmother, it was almost normal back then for him to go missing for 2 or 3 days at a time in their local forest, even at the age of 6, as he started walking around enjoying nature without a care in the world. So after she and the family realized they couldn't really stop him from hiking out like that, it became a regular thing for him to disappear into the trees whenever the mood struck. That love of nature stayed with my father through his whole life though, never fading no matter how old he got or what else pulled at him. He went out hunting and camping regularly even now, knowing those woods like the back of his hand from years spent out there alone. So I am telling you all of this to give you some context about the man, since he spent his whole life surrounded by nature, could recognize every sound that came from the trees, and knew every animal at a glance without ever second-guessing himself. He told me this story for the first time 10 years ago, sitting us down one evening with a serious look on his face that I hardly ever saw. As a skeptic back then, I didn't pay much attention to it at first, since I believed it to be a tall tale he came up with to entertain or scare us kids around the fire. That was when he started retelling it, from time to time over the years, yet every detail stayed exactly the same, and I noticed he got visibly nervous during its retellings. So I began to take it seriously after a while, realizing this was not like him at all, since he was not easily scared of anything in the woods after a lifetime out there. That was when I felt like I could trust him completely with this, and started to believe his story came straight from something real that he lived through. He always stuck to the facts without embellishing, which made me listen closer each time he brought it up. Now for the story. There was one time he spent the night out in the forest with his dog, a dachshund he had trained specifically for hunting through the underbrush and brush. So he was walking down a road that split the forest into 2 parts, following the path under the stars with his dog trotting ahead as always. That was when he realized his dog had stopped walking dead in front and ran back to sit straight behind his legs, ears flat and whining low. Next, my father looked up and saw someone coming out from the trees on one side, figuring at first it was a person on the back of a horse, since he caught the reflections of an eye glinting in the dark ahead. So he stood there watching closer, but then realized those eyes sat way too high up off the ground to belong to any walking person he knew from around those parts. That was when he saw the eyes were bigger than any normal human's eyes, about the size of tennis balls, he said, and spaced out really far apart across whatever head carried them through the shadows. I heard him describe how the creature seemed to look around at first, since the reflections disappeared for a moment then reappeared, as if it turned its head side to side scanning the road. So when it saw my father standing there, or at least acknowledged his presence in the moonlight, it fixed those huge eyes right on him without blinking and came out from the trees slowly. Next, according to Dad, it was levitating clear as day, hovering at least 50 centimeters off the ground, with no legs or feet touching down anywhere. He also noticed it made no sound at all. It was completely silent through the crisp night air, and the skinny frame was wrapped in some kind of robe that hid everything else from view. There was nothing else to see besides those eyes, which appeared to be a mix of red, brown and grey in the faint light, though he admitted the moon and stars provided only glow, so he wasn't entirely sure about the exact color. He compared it straight to a Dementor from Harry Potter, floating eerily with its hooded shape gliding along. The creature did not confront my father or come any closer to where he stood with the dog trembling behind him. It simply levitated straight down the path, passing him by at a steady pace, then disappeared into the woods on the other side of the road without turning back once. So this part struck me as weirder than it sounded at first, since that side of the forest was just a narrow strip, 3 or 4 meters wide, thick with trees and undergrowth, but right after sat a solid concrete fence, separating it from a factory beyond. That was when my father turned back right away, not wanting to risk running into it a second time out there alone in the dark, with only his dog for company. So he spent the rest of the night camped in a very different area further down the main trail, away from that road and whatever crossed that evening. Next, in the morning light, he came back to check the spot carefully, looking for any trails or signs the creature left behind, but found no footprints or broken branches, nothing to show it had ever been there at all. I lived in a quiet village in the south of Germany, right next to a rather large forest, filled with hiking and biking trails that would meander through the trees for miles around our area. When I was little, it would be either my aunt or my dad who took me there for walks almost every second day, which made the outings a regular part of my childhood, which I looked forward to each time. So it's fair to say, I knew the area, and that turned into a habit for me to keep going on walks through the forest later in life as well, even when I had grown up. A few months ago, all of that changed one night. I usually went on walks with music during daytime hours, keeping the paths bathed in sunlight where everything was familiar and safe. That was when one evening during a full moon, with clear skies overhead, I felt a little brave and bored, so decided to go for a stroll after dark for the first time in a long time. I grabbed a torch just in case the path got a bit too dark, picked up my phone to keep the music going, and headed out the door into the cool night air alone. I set off down my usual route, seeing the moonlight filter through the branches as it lit up the trail enough to see where I placed my feet. I was halfway through the trail when I came across a little bridge that led deeper into the forest, a spot I had crossed hundreds of times before during daytime walks with no trouble at all. One of my songs faded out slowly at that moment, and before the next track could start playing through my earphones, I heard the most blood-curdling scream that I had ever heard in my entire life echo sharply from the trees ahead. I took my headphones off quickly, thinking maybe a boar or another forest critter had stepped into a trap, since that kind of thing happens from time to time around here, with all the hunters in the area. Then I took a step closer, moving half over the bridge to get a better look into the shadows beyond, and I heard it again. This time closer, even more piercing through the air. I turned on my torch. My hands were shaking slightly from the shock, and shone the beam around the trees. And that is when I saw it clear as day in the light. A snow-white, skinny face with pitch-dark eyes, looking straight at me from between dark trunks nearby. I had never felt this horrified in my entire life up until that point, as my insides told me if I took another step forward across the bridge, something terrible would happen to me right then and there. I did not care what might come after me or block my way. I turned around immediately without another thought and ran the other way home, straight through the moonlit path. Next, I felt a considerable feeling of dread press in the back of my neck the whole time during that run. That was when I burst through my front doors finally, slammed it shut, and locked it tight behind me, then leaned against the wall inside to catch my breath after the panic. So I stood there shaking for a minute, heart racing wild in my chest, trying to make sense of the face and scream that replayed over in my mind. I checked all the windows and doors twice that night, making sure nothing followed me back from the forest's edge. But ever since that night, whenever I stayed home alone, I'd feel watched and uneasy in broad daylight. I'd also hear footsteps on the porch, and my garden furniture was moved around on several occasions. I have no clue what that white face with dark eyes could have been, or why it seemed to stalk me with those ongoing signs around my place. So if anyone knows what lurked there in the German forest or how to make it stop, I would love to hear your thoughts. I was driving home from work late one night. It must have been around 10:30 p.m., overcast with a little fog sometime in late fall. My route took me off the highway and through a farming area with thick trees on the left and fields on the right. The road was really straight, and my headlights reached far ahead. I was scanning for deer, which I often saw on this road. A ways ahead of me, I saw movement in the tree line, so I started to slow down. Instead of deer, a person slipped out the tree line. They didn't have a flashlight or cell phone light. They sauntered onto the road, and I slowed down even more. I couldn't see any clear features, but it was clearly a person with long legs and thin arms. I could see the bend of their knees, the swing of their arms. They were still pretty far ahead, about a halfway mark across the road. They swiveled their head to look in my direction, and in one fluid motion fell to all fours, and they took off in a loping, bounding run into the field. I was able to see them for a few seconds more, and it was fast. My dad's a hunter, so I asked him what he thought. He said it was probably a bear and showed me some videos, but it didn't look anything like a bear. It was too thin, too lanky, and I could clearly see the bends in its knees and elbows. It walked with the fluid confidence of a person, yet bounded away like a beast. It's been years now, and every once in a while I'll think about it and watch more videos of bears walking, and it still doesn't match. And I can't convince myself that's what it was. And yes, I've stopped taking that route home. I spent the extra 5 minutes to go the long way. I was about 14 years old in 2003 when I saw something in the woods that I had never been able to explain, no matter how much I turned it over in my head. So let me take you back. I grew up in western North Carolina among the Appalachian foothills, surrounded by thick woods, populated with deer, black bears, and coyotes. So those areas held nothing exotic like primates running around free, just the usual wildlife I knew from years spent near my house. That was when one afternoon I walked through a patch of woods not far from home. It was a spot I had been back to plenty of times without thinking twice about it. It was not deep wilderness at all, just one of those semi-rural wooded areas tucked behind someone's house along the edge of town. And that's when I got that gut feeling that I was being watched, cutting through me. I scanned the trees slowly, eyes moving branch to branch under the afternoon light filtering down. And that was when I saw it crouched on a thick branch, maybe 20 to 25 feet up, clear against the leaves and bark. The best way to describe it would be an orangutan-lemur hybrid, with long arms, a compact body, and a sort of hunched posture. The limbs looked too long for its torso hanging there steady, the fur appearing dark, maybe reddish-brown or greyish through the cover. It's hard to pin down exactly in the dappled shade, so it was not shaped like a bear cub at all that I recognized from past sightings, and definitely not a raccoon scrambling around clumsily. That was when I focused on the face, clearest of all, not like a raccoon's muzzle or snout, like a fox prowling nearby, but more primate-like, with forward-facing eyes, staring down. It sat there watching me without moving a muscle, locked in place as our eyes met. That was when it moved without warning. I do not mean it climbed down slowly towards me. It launched sideways through the trees fast, arm over arm swinging, but more controlled and efficient than any monkey I'd ever seen at a zoo or on TV. Within a few seconds it had moved right through the canopy above, disappearing completely from view without a trace left behind. There were no crashing branches shaking down like a bear would cause, and I stood there trying to convince myself I misidentified something ordinary in the adrenaline rush. That's when I thought of a juvenile bear, perhaps blending into the leaves. But I had seen both plenty of times around the foothills and knew that this was not the case. So for the next few years I kept half expecting an article about someone's escaped exotic pet turning up, since North Carolina folk keep weird animals sometimes, even out in rural spots. I never found anything like reports or chatter about it anywhere after searching for it, and I quietly shelved it in my brain as that weird thing I once saw. Until a few years down the line, I was listening to an episode of the podcast Lore during a drive, hearing them mention pugwidges from Algonquin folklore out of nowhere. The description talked about small upright beings living in wooded areas, watching people from trees, throwing rocks sometimes, and disappearing quickly when spotted. I actually paused the episode right there because chills hit me hard from how close it matched. Still, I did not jump straight to that, as that was what I saw back then, not claiming folklore proved real or anything like that. But the watching from the trees part struck me immediately, uncomfortably close to what locked eyes with me that afternoon. Fast forward to a few months ago when, for reasons I cannot really justify even now, I went back to that same patch of wood after not stepping foot in there for years. I was older by then, figured I would probably feel silly for getting creeped out by shadows in those trees as a kid. I was maybe 10 minutes walking familiar ground when something smacked me hard in the shoulder out of nowhere. That was when I realized it was not a branch falling loose above, but a small rock thrown with real force that stung and hit my shirt. I looked up immediately, scanning the branches, and about 30 feet away, partially behind a tree, I saw a small outline standing there, short, maybe 3 or 4 feet tall if I guessed, thin frame half hidden, but enough to know it was not a deer or person messing around. That's when it moved. Just like years earlier, the second it seemed to register I was looking straight at it, it darted off low and quick behind trees in seconds. I did not chase after it into the brush or call out wandering, and I didn't stick around even a minute longer than I needed to, and was gone. I left that patch of woods straight away, heading back to familiar ground without looking over my shoulder once. A past co-worker and friend of mine called Ralph was on vacation visiting family on the island of Puerto Rico. One day while walking down a sidewalk bordering a busy 2-lane highway, something very odd occurred. The layout is important, so picture this. A highway running straight through a small valley, with large hills rising steeply on each side, like a river cutting through a low mountain range. People were walking up and down the hillside, going about their day. As Ralph strolled along the sidewalk, he began to notice cars slowing down, then stopping entirely. Pedestrians slowed down too, until, most surprisingly, this woman walking very close to him, talking on her cell phone, just froze in place mid-step, mid-sentence, completely still. He looked around, thinking he was losing his mind, and realized everything was frozen in time. Every car, every person. The whole scene looked like a photograph, everything, except him. Then, atop of the hillside, a hole appeared in the air. It didn't belong there, a void or gateway of some kind floating just above the ground. Ralph said it looked like the inside of a volcano spewing fire and black smoke. Suddenly, something leaped out. It shot down the hillside so fast it looked like lightning weaving in, out, and between the now stationary people. But sometimes it didn't go around them. It physically moved them aside, shoving them out of its path like obstacles, only for them to snap back into place a moment later. Ralph went slack-jawed and without thinking, started pointing at it. The entity reached the bottom of the hill and stopped right in front of him, exactly where the woman on her phone had been standing. She was now suspended mid-air about 2 feet off the ground, but shifted slightly from side to side. Her movements slowed with an unnatural crawl, like someone had turned a time dial all the way down. The entity itself was translucent, short, and skinny in stature, with a giant light bulb-shaped head, like classic alien depictions, but an even larger cranium. Its 2 big eyes had vertical slits for pupils, like a snake's, along with 2 vertical slits where a nose would be, and a horizontal slit for a mouth. Catfish-like tentacles hung from below the nose slits, draping over the mouth, while its very long arms ended in extended fingers and hands that dragged on the ground. It had gigantic feet, and strangely enough, it was wearing clothes. Oversized red shoes like clown shoes, khaki chino pants rolled up to the ankle, a white button-up shirt with cuffs rolled, and a baseball cap perched atop its massive head. As Ralph stood there pointing, the entity spoke to him telepathically in English, which he found odd, as they were in Puerto Rico. It said, "I see that you can see me," and Ralph blurted out, "What are you?" The being did a strange bow and replied, "I am a refugee." Immediately after, it jumped completely, clearing the highway in one bound, and shot like lightning up the opposite hillside. The moment it was out of sight, time snapped back to normal, and everything resumed. Cars honked, people walked and talked, the woman on her phone kept going as if nothing had happened. Ralph has never seen it since. I lived in a small town called Bastrop in Louisiana, sharing a place with my cousin and his wife, where life moved slow in Morehouse Parish, with not much to do besides driving back roads like we had done thousands of times before. I had never told anyone about this outside of the people with me that night, or my best friend who later claimed to have seen something similar on a different date, that I did not know about until I described my experience to him in detail. So that made the whole thing hit even harder when I finally shared it, confirming we were not alone in what crossed our paths out there. So one night in 2015, we finished clearing a church that we looked after regularly, and it was around 2 a.m. when we piled into my cousin's 1990 GMC Sierra, a single cab 4x4 that rattled along those familiar roads. We decided to ride the back roads home as always, cruising slowly under the dark sky, with me and him talking steadily in the front seats. Next, his wife had fallen asleep in the middle seat between us, head resting against the window while we listened to Nirvana playing from the stereo. That was when we turned onto a paved road about 5 miles outside of town, headlights cutting through the thick Louisiana night as we came around a sharp curve ahead. So right there in the middle of the road, something caught the beams that we had never seen before, stopping us solid in our tracks before we could even process it. Now I was an avid hunter who spent all hours in the woods at night and day. Plus, time in the army had toughened me up, but nothing prepared me for how freaked out I felt by what stood there in front of us. I saw something dead lying in the road, some animal carcass torn open, and hunched over it was a creature eating away. That was when it looked up at us, about 2.5 to 3 foot tall, as it knelt there over whatever it fed on, red eyes glowing bright in the glare like embers burning in the dark. My cousin hit the brakes hard, truck skidding a bit on the pavement while his wife stirred awake. Then it stood up so fast, it seemed like no time had passed at all, stretched to 7 or 8 feet tall in one fluid motion, and I saw its skin, pitch black, looking like a bat skin stretched tight but darker. Next, in one swoop, it leapt into the air off the road, wings opening wide, as it flew straight into the woods on the side, moving easily over 50 miles an hour through the trees. So we sat there frozen for a moment, engine idling, while Nirvana was fading out on the stereo, all three of us staring at the empty spot where it had vanished to in the shadows. I turned to my cousin, asked if he saw the same red eyes I did, and he nodded quickly without a word. His wife then gripped the seat tight, wide awake now, whispering that she caught the whole thing from her spot in the middle as it took off flying. Then, we drove off slowly from there, avoiding that curve for weeks after and sticking to the main roads even if it took longer. The image stuck with me hard. That black-skinned thing standing over the dead animal, the red eyes locked on our truck before the wings snapped open and carried it away. That was when I realized my army time and hunting nights in the Louisiana woods never showed me anything close to that speed or shape. Ever since that night in 2015, I stayed cynical about paranormal stuff, but I knew exactly what I saw with my cousin and his wife, plus my best friend's story matching later on. I know there's something that lives out there, but what it is, I can't say for certain. Back in the early 2000s, one of my uncle's friends, who flew small aircrafts for a living, told him about something strange he saw while cruising over the Cascade Range in Washington state on a clear day. He had been flying near Mount St. Helens just for fun, enjoying the view with nothing unusual going on around him at first. That was when he noticed something huge circling slow near the crater up there, catching his eye against the bright sky and rocky slopes below. At first he thought it was perspective messing with him from that height, maybe a trick of distance making things look off as they often did up in the air. The longer he watched it, turning steadily on those thermals, the less sense it made to his experienced eyes scanning the horizon. He described it to my uncle as a massive, black bird-shaped thing gliding out there, not like an eagle with its familiar spread or a condor soaring wide. That was when he used the words pterodactyl-shaped exactly, long wings stretched out narrow, body slim and pulled back, big enough that from his distance it did not look much smaller than his own plane cutting through the clouds. That freaked him out hard, he later said. It felt wrong to see something that size riding the warm air currents over a volcano, like it belonged up there watching everything below. He cut his flight short then, turned the plane around and headed back to base earlier than planned, without another loop around the peak. My aunt always loved folklore and weird history growing up around those parts, and that was when she worked at a local museum archive back then, so naturally she went digging through records for anything about giant birds tied to the region after hearing this story firsthand, and she ended up reading various indigenous legends from the Pacific Northwest, stories of enormous storm birds living high in the mountains that appeared before natural disasters would shake the ground. Next, she fell down a rabbit hole about thunderbird myths from several tribes around there, massive creatures linked to thunder and warnings from above the peaks. Half joking over dinner one night, she started calling whatever he saw Ridgeback, giving it a name that stuck around our family talks for years. And then about 5 months later, Mount St. Helens had a noticeable eruptive event. Not the big 1980s blast everyone remembered, but enough ash and rubble to make headlines across Washington. So my aunt swore up and down it could not be a coincidence, tying those dots together, the black shape circling months before the mountain stirred under pressure again. Fast forward a few years when my cousin and I went out the Washington coast near the ocean shores, walking the beach and messing around under a clear sky stretching forever inland. That was when way off towards the haze, if you squinted hard, you could make out Mount Rainier rising sharply above everything else dominating the view. My younger cousin pointed out suddenly and said there is a hawk circling there, pulling us all to look up from the sand and waves around our feet. And we saw something way out towards the mountain, a distance so far it should have been tiny against the blue. But whatever moved stood clear and bold no matter how many miles we sat away from it. It looked enormous even from the beach, way too big to be a hawk. And the wings appeared long and slightly angled, gliding smoothly. Even at that range, it did not match a normal bird silhouette cutting the sky. My aunt did not even hesitate watching the drift, and just said that it was Ridgeback. We kind of laughed at first, thinking she joked around like that always with her stories, but none of us could explain what showed so plainly against the distant haze up high, blending into the clouds until nothing stood out anymore from our spot or the shore. About 8 or 9 months later, Mount Rainier had a series of seismic events with ash emissions shutting down parts around it for a while, though thankfully, nothing catastrophic happened. A few years ago, I was living down the shore in Point Pleasant, working seasonal jobs, and enjoying the quiet that comes after the summer tourists disappear. It was October, and one afternoon I drove down to Atlantic City just to get out for the day. I stayed later than I meant to, and by the time I started heading back north, I was exhausted. Instead of pushing through the drive, I decided to grab a cheap motel off Route 9 in Waretown, right where the Pine Barrens press up against the marshland in Ocean County. If you've ever been through that stretch at night, you know it feels different from places like Seaside Heights or LBI. There are longer gaps between buildings and fewer streetlights, and the trees seem to crowd the road. And the motel I picked looked worn down and mostly empty. The pool was covered for the season, and the patio furniture was stacked and strapped, and only one dim exterior light flicked near the office. The couple running the place said they were from a Central Asian country, but I can no longer recall which. They were polite but quiet, and the whole check-in felt subdued. When I get to my room, my stomach dropped. The carpet, for a start, felt damp under my feet, and the bedspread had a stiff, overwashed look that made you question everything. I thought I saw a small, dark speck move near the mattress seam. That was enough for me. I grabbed towels from the bathroom, laid them out in the tub, and decided I would rather sleep there than risk waking up covered in bites. It wasn't comfortable, but I figured it was only for one night. Or sometime around 2 a.m. I woke up to a loud crash that shook the bathroom door. For a moment, I thought something had fallen in the room. But then it came again. An explosive full-force slam that rattled the side door leading to the pool area. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't someone testing the handle. It sounded like something was hurling its entire weight against the door, and the frame shuddered with the impact. At first, I tried rationalize it. Maybe drunk teenagers had hopped the fence and were messing around near the covered pool. But the pool was closed for the season, wrapped tightly in a heavy tarp, and there hadn't been more than one other car in the lot when I arrived. Besides, the force behind those blows didn't sound like kids playing a prank. It was too deliberate. Then I heard a sound that made all the hairs on my arms stand on end. It started high and sharp, almost like distant children laughing, but it twisted mid-note into something guttural and animalistic. The closest comparison I can make is that it sounded like laughter forced through a throat built for growling. It hit the door again harder this time, and I genuinely thought the glass would break. My body reacted before my brain caught up. I grabbed my keys, and rushed out the main room door into the exterior corridor. The moment my feet hit the concrete walkway, the pounding stopped. Not fade out, but stopped completely. And the silence was so sudden it felt unreal. There were no retreating footsteps or splashing from the pool area, no voices laughing or whispering that would indicate it be teenagers. Nothing. I stood there for at least a minute, heart hammering, staring towards the dark shape in the pine barrens behind the property. The tree line was a solid black wall under the moonlight. It felt like something could just be standing inside watching, but giving me nothing to see in return. Eventually I walked towards the front office, half expecting to find someone outside, but the lot was empty. The next morning I mentioned what happened to one of the owners. I expected him to dismiss or blame it on the wind, but he paused and said, "Sometimes things come from the woods." He chose not to elaborate, and I chose not to press him. Later at a gas station down the road, some guy I ended up chatting to, who was working near a warehouse nearby, said that they'd experienced similar things, and insinuated that it might be the Jersey Devil. I haven't stayed anywhere near the Pine Barrens since. This happened to me about 3-ish years ago now, and to this day I don't know what I saw. I always figured it was a weird-looking animal, but it was definitely humanoid. I hope no one thinks I'm crazy, because where it happened considering how many people were around, but ever since this encounter, I've never hung out around natural parks or semi-natural places where you have to put up your high beams at night. I get the feeling I'm being watched. Anyway, this happened near the Santa Monica Mountains near Los Angeles or Malibu. I kept bugging my boyfriend at the time that I wanted to see shooting stars. This was in late summertime, and obviously living in LA, it's always full of smog and light pollution, and you have to drive a minimum 2 hours to find a good spot. But we wanted to stay near and, well, picked those mountains, since they had good reviews and I've been there before, no problem. And I wasn't the only one with the same idea, because there was a meteor shower. So, in the near entrance of the park, some people already had their telescopes up. My dumbass introverted idea was to go past these people, so we could be alone. It was dumb, yes, past the parking lot and pretty much looked like a trail. He agreed and we picked a lonely spot. We did see another couple stay near, but that's it. The walk was less than a mile to the spot we were at, and that couple disappeared towards some rock formation nearby. I laid my blanket down, and the meteor shower did not disappoint, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up, and I got goosebumps and the feeling of being watched. I turned around, and nothing. My boyfriend kept telling me to calm down, and that I was just imagining things, especially because we basically illegally parked, and just like everyone else did, I didn't want my car impounded, so he excused it on my paranoia. But I felt like we were being stalked, and I just had the most horrible feeling. So we were sitting for about 10 minutes, and I couldn't take it anymore. I said I wanted to go home because something was indeed watching us. A single coyote. Now coyotes are tiny, but they do hunt in packs from what I knew, and it was alone. It went into a bush, I assumed because I lost sight of it, but the horrible feeling was still there. And on top of that, my boyfriend kept cracking jokes, saying I was just paranoid and afraid of a little coyote. But respectfully, I didn't want to be bitten. I started speed walking towards the car, and my boyfriend kept making fun of me, asking me to slow down, and I turned around. And it was at that moment I caught a glimpse of it. Walking towards the spot, there are street lamps towards the trail, and this thing was avoiding the lamps. But next to it was the coyote from earlier, and it stopped. The thing was hyperfixated, face smushed to the ground, where I was standing earlier. I didn't have a good glimpse of it, till it stood under a light, and turned to its side. And that is when the dread hit me. I wanted to start running, but with flip-flops, I was definitely going to fall flat on my face, and my boyfriend wasn't helping. He started calling this thing out, saying it was a dog or a messed up coyote, but once it stood under the light, his laughter died. I also noticed that, you know how at night you can hear crickets as well as bugs? When this coyote appeared, all the sounds of the night switched off. This thing, I was able to compare it with the coyote, was way bigger. No fur, with grey and pale skin. It almost looked human, but down on all fours. Some details were off. It had no snout, and from what I could make out, had no ears that were anything like a coyote's. It looked human, but not really. It had weird legs like a dog or a cat, and the fingers were abnormally huge, skinny, long fingers with a huge back spine bones sticking out, and a stomach so tucked in like a hungry dog. And it started to follow us while having the face smushed into the ground, quickly walking towards us. We started to jog, trying to be quiet, and I was trying hard not to cry because that thing looked like the monster from Pan's Labyrinth. Once we reached the trailhead, we noticed the cops were kicking people out of the area, and I was relieved. We got into my car, and I didn't speak for the whole ride back. We had nightmares about that thing for a week straight. I told my brothers about it, and family, and some said it was a nawal, a witch from my culture that transforms into animals, and others say a skinwalker or nightcrawler. Whatever it was, all I know is I'm never going out at night into wilderness parks, especially with someone who has the survival skills of a turnip. Every time I'm out at natural parks with friends or families for trips or a hike, I catch a glimpse of a coyote here and there, and they'll just stare at me. And for my own safety, I think I'll stop going altogether to avoid any trouble. My family has lived in Austin their whole lives. A few years back, they moved into a nice house on the Colorado River. And flash forward to a few weeks ago, things started to get weird. First happening, my dad and mum love feeding the ducks. They're getting old, and they started getting a large congregation. I want to say about 3 weeks ago was when a few of the ducks started being killed and dragged to their back door. They thought it must have been a neighbor's cat because it had teeth marks, but the neighbor said their cat had died a month ago or so before. The second event happened one night when my mum said she heard the sound of one of their ducks being mauled, so she got my dad to run out to scare the thing off. But sadly it was too dark or far off into the water for them to see. However, they both swear they saw green, glowing eyes. The latest event is my mum swears that something started rearranging all her lawn decorations. The houses along the river have backyard lawns that are very well kept for the passing boats and tourists, so she has a bunch of gnomes and flamingos and whatnot. Keep Austin weird, I know. Well, it apparently started out with little things moved here and there, but quickly ended up with all her decorations being thrown into a heap. I've since visited and can confirm the lawn, and have also seen the photos of the ducks. This can't be a person because they would hear a boat approach and have motion sensor lights which have failed to go off. Could this be a cryptid? Has anyone heard of a water monster near Austin or Central Texas? I really would like to get to the bottom of this mystery. I was on a ferry for a school softball trip in 2014 when I was 18 years old, heading through the San Juan Islands in Washington during a late May evening around 11 p.m. If you've ever been that far north in late spring, you know it does not get properly dark until really late, with the sun basically dragging its feet about setting behind the horizon. So a bunch of us, maybe 9 or 10 in total, had snuck up to the outer deck to watch the water, smoke, and act like dumb teenagers without adult supervision. That was when we stood there, feeling the cold air bite a bit, though not unbearably against our skin, while the water stayed calm enough to see the ferry wake clearly churn behind us in the dim light. Next, someone pointed out dorsal fins cutting through the wake, sharp shapes rising and falling with the waves as we all leaned over the railing to look closer. So we saw orcas out there pacing alongside, which honestly felt pretty normal in that area since they all showed up a lot during those trips through the island. I knew what orca fins looked like from seeing them before. Tall, smooth, black triangles, usually 4 to 6 feet high on adult males, with clean, straight edges slicing the surface perfectly. That was when we counted maybe 10 to 15 of them weaving in and out of the wake, a few smaller ones mixed in the group as they kept pace with the ferry for a good while. So we tried taking pictures on our phones, but the devices sucked back then, and the light faded low already, making everything blurry despite our best efforts to capture them. Next, it took a good 30 minutes for the whole pod to pass by completely, their fins slipping under one by one until nothing moved in the water behind us anymore. That was when we started to sober up from the night air, feeling the cold settle deeper, and talk about heading inside to warm up before anyone caught us out there. So we lingered a moment longer, scanning the open water that stretched flat ahead, when one of the younger girls spoke up quietly and said there was another one coming. I turned with everyone else, expecting a stray orca fin to break through like the others had done before, leaning forward over the rail to spot it in the faint glow. At first, that was exactly what it looked like. One dorsal fin cutting clean through the surface about 20 or 30 feet off the side of the ferry. Then another rose right behind it. Then one more. Then 2 others popping up in quick succession, and we all were frozen watching. So those were wrong from the start. Taller by far than any orca fin I recognized, jagged and uneven instead of smooth, some looking torn or chipped along the edges harshly. That was when I realized they were not spaced out like separate animals swimming independently, but lined up in 2 rough rows, running parallel across whatever moved beneath them steadily. Next, we could just barely see the shape of its back under the surface, lit faintly by the ferry light spilling over the railing. I saw more of those spikes break the surface one after another, as it kept coming without pause, easily 8 to 10 feet each, some leaning slightly while others looked scarred. That's when the body underneath kept going long past what made sense for a single whale. This dark mass stretching out with no end in sight. No one said a word among the 10 of us standing there. The deck had now gone silent. Whatever was down there should not exist. I knew we had all turned earlier to watch a whale pass like normal, but now faced something that clearly was not a whale at all, moving so differently from anything familiar. It showed no visible blow spouting up, no rolling body arching through, no fluke breaking the surface to signal a dive ahead. That was when this long, dark mass, with rows of jagged dorsal spikes, sliced through steady like a saw blade gliding parallel, staying alongside the ferry for a solid 6 or 7 minutes that felt endless in the cold. So based on how long it took for the last of the spikes to pass our position, I figured it had to be huge out there, 60 feet at least or maybe longer. Next, I noticed it followed the exact path of the orcas that went by 30 to 40 minutes earlier, not cruising at random, but tracking steadily in the same direction. That was when I felt like it was hunting out there, orcas being top predators that feared little, yet this thing trailed their pod completely comfortably. Someone tried getting a photo in that moment, fumbling with their phone against the dark, but by then the lighting had failed completely, with only the ferry windows spilling faint glows over the rails. Eventually, the last of those spikes slipped beneath the surface, water going flat again without a splash. I don't know what kind of creature that was. I guess it qualifies as a cryptid, but if anyone has any info regarding it, I'd love to hear it. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. It really does mean a hell of a lot for you to listen to these stories, so thank you for being here. And if you would like to support long-form creators like myself, liking, subbing, pressing the bell go a seriously long way, and it would be appreciated, so thank you guys. I'd like to extend my appreciation to all my lovely members and patrons whose names are on screen right now. For signing up, they get a bunch of cool perks, and if you're interested in finding out what those are, links down below. But that's it from me. Stay awesome, guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night. Good evening all, and welcome. I'm going to be taking you to a tour of haunted hotels in tonight's video. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I'm sharing this story because I need to get it out of my system. It happened a few weeks ago during a 3-night stay at Hacienda Sasquatch, which is a remote hotel just outside the town of Izamal in Yucatan, Mexico. I had no idea it was haunted or any kind of reputation whatsoever when we booked it. It came up in a travel blog as a hidden gem. It was quiet and beautiful and small, and honestly it looked perfect for disconnecting. And we wanted somewhere isolated for a romantic getaway. Merida was only about an hour away, and the place felt worlds apart. It's tucked back from roads amid high trees and lots of empty fields, and if you've never heard of it, which I don't blame you as it's only got like 4 or 7 rooms or something, it's a restored colonial hacienda with white stone walls, a few high arches, and a long courtyard, and a big pool that glows turquoise at night. The rooms are in low buildings around the garden, and it's all stone floor with some heavy wooden doors. We arrived late afternoon. Our rental car kicked up a surprising amount of gravel on the driveway. We were actually concerned we had damaged it, as we didn't want to be charged if there was some kind of damage. And the sun was just starting to set. The main building had the classic hacienda features of wide verandas and a few lanterns hanging on iron brackets. The whole place looked pristine, a lovely boutique that looked frozen in time. We were given a room right outside the restaurant area, and the restaurant itself had a handful of tables and chairs, all made of heavy metal. Remember this, as this will be important for later. We unpacked, explored the small amount of ground, and went to eat in Izamal, the village, and came back. Well, that night at around 2 AM, I woke up, because I could hear a horrible screeching noise ripping through the silence. It was this metal dragging across stone, long and deliberate, like someone had gripped that heavy chair just outside the room and was pushing it slowly to make the most hideous noise. My heart slammed as I bolted upright. My boyfriend was dead asleep beside me. The sound cut off with a dull clunk, leaving me in total silence. I grabbed my phone, and it was 2:03 AM, and crept to the door. There was no way I was staying in bed. I needed to see who the hell thought this would be funny to do at 2 AM. So I opened the door. Outside, there was a single lit lamp by the pool, casting a weak yellow light, but I could see no movement. There was no one outside. The tables were but a stone throw away from me, and there was no one there either. I took a few steps out, I couldn't see any wandering staff, and the position of the courtyard itself meant this whole place was very open, so I should have seen someone, or at least heard them. They wouldn't have had enough time to go anywhere without me hearing them running away on the stones. None of this made sense. I looked around the dim light and decided I'd ignore it, and went back to bed and just lay there staring at the ceiling. Maybe it was someone in another room rearranging their furniture. I mean, sound carries weird on stones, but it took me a while to fall asleep again. In the morning, the hacienda looked idyllic again. The sun was shining on the pool. The beautiful birds I'd never seen before were making cute little sounds, and breakfast was fresh papaya, sweet bread, and nice coffee in the courtyard. I told my boyfriend about it, and he said it could have just been a dream. We headed into the village of Izamal again, climbed the pyramid for a lovely view over the yellow town, had some traditional marquesitas, which were a bit like crepes, but stuffed with cheese as well as Nutella, and wandered the Covent Square, normal couple stuff. By evening, the grounds glowed under the lantern. The pool lights made the pool turn an ethereal blue-green, and we read by the poolside with a bottle of wine. Exhausted from the sun and the travel, we turned in early, and I think it got dark round about 6. By 8, I was out. But again, I was woken up in the night. Not to sound this time, but to pressure. The feeling of eyes on me. My skin prickled, and I roused, feeling groggy. Something was wrong. I looked down towards the end of the bed, and that's when I saw a clear indentation on the mattress cover, sunk down in the perfect rounded dip right at the corner, with human-sized weight, like there was some invisible person perched on the edge. I stared at it. The sag was too precise for old springs. It definitely had a aliveness to it. My boyfriend, ever the useful companion in spooky situations, was snoring heavily beside me. Throat dry, skin creeping with fear, I shifted my hip fractionally towards it. The mattress rose smoothly, the dip flattening as if whatever was pressing it down had stood up and stepped away. The air cooled around my legs, and I yanked my knees to my chest, clutching the sheets, staring at the empty spot. The bedposts loomed shadowy against the wall, but there was nothing else. No more noise, no more anything. And I was left dumbstruck and horrified. I lay rigid for hours, listening to every noise my boyfriend made, every tiny imperceptible sound from other rooms, and I knew I hadn't imagined it. I knew the bed had moved. I slept very poorly that night, and when the sunlight started to flood in, the room felt safe again. We spent the day out, seeing more ruins, venturing further afield to see other things as well, swim in a cenote, but the tension gnawed at me, and I was relieved that this was our last night in this hotel. I told my boyfriend again, but he told me I had probably just dreamt it again. I wasn't finding these answers very reassuring, and part of me wondered if I was losing my mind. As we had gone swimming, on the final night I crashed hard. I was bone tired. When halfway through sleep, footsteps yanked me awake again. I could hear soft scuffs outside the door, deliberate paces on stone. It didn't sound like shoes, more like bare feet. My boyfriend slept on, and I sat up listening. Another step closer. Maybe it was a fellow guest. But at this point, it didn't sound like they were just moving to their room. It sounded like they were just making the tappity-tap noises on purpose, perhaps to piss off fellow guests. And I had had enough. I opened the door to our room, and of course, the footsteps stopped. The courtyard lay dark, with the pool glowing faintly and the ever-present one light. I could smell the damp earth. I scanned the pillars and the path, and then movement flashed from the peripheral. It was a tall human shape, a shadow, darting quickly behind a column. It was a fluid movement, and it was gone in the blink of an eye. When I looked towards that column, expecting someone to come out from behind it, no one ever did. I slowly crept out my door to move my body into a position where I should be able to see behind that column. But when I did, there was nothing. And so I went back to the room, closed the door, and curled under the sheets, replaying the scene in my mind. We checked out in the morning, bright and early. As I slid the key over, the concierge asked if everything had been okay with my stay. And then the words just tumbled out, vaguely. Does anything unusual happen here at night? Like funny noises or anything? The receptionist's face shifted, knowingly. She went on to tell me that I was not the first guest, nor would I be the last in experiencing the creepier side of the haciendas. She went on to tell me something that I hadn't really thought about. Haciendas, these big old colonial homes, are where the Spanish or Spanish descendants held the native Mayan people as basically slaves and forced them to do labor on their land until the end of their days. There was certainly a lot of violence here, a lot of despair, and a lot of negativity. And it's unsurprising that some of it stays behind in the form of hauntings or unfinished business, the precise nature of which they never exactly said what, but that it wasn't a surprise to them that these things persisted, and that I should just try my best not to worry about it. Thankfully, the rest of my time in Mexico was not spooky whatsoever. We loaded the bags quickly and drove away, letting the hacienda shrink into the mirror. In my lifetime, I've worked for several different hotel and motel chains, as well as a few timeshare resorts, so I've seen just about everything you could imagine in that environment, from strangers forming an instant shaky bond after being caught in the crossfires of a deranged gunman, to the horror of witnessing a jumper, to the happier side of things like helping couples celebrate wedding anniversaries and other big occasions. I've also run into plenty of strange and borderline unexplainable incidents along the way. Some with a fairly logical explanation, and some that resisted any sort of practical reasoning. What happened at this particular place definitely falls into the latter category. And for context, I don't scare easily. A few years back, I decided to take a solo trip to the Blue Ridge Mountains. I like traveling, and this trip was meant to be a simple camping run. I didn't plan it in obsessive detail. I mostly knew which general spots I wanted to stop at and which routes I wanted to take. I've done solo camping trips before and they've never bothered me. I'm always well armed when I travel like that, so if anything were to jump out at me in the dark, be it animal or human, it would probably end up getting shot on sight before it had much chance to cause trouble. I booked sites at various campgrounds along my planned path, making sure each spot was reasonably close to the main road, so that if I needed to leave quickly for any reason, I'd be able to get out without navigating miles of back road in the middle of the night. I left after work on a Friday, drove for about 5 hours steady, and ended up on the outskirts of Bluefield, West Virginia. By that point, I was tired enough that the idea of setting up camp didn't sound appealing, so I decided to grab a hotel room for the night. After about 20 minutes of driving around and checking my options, I came across one of those old independent mom-and-pop motels, which had about 20 rooms all in all with individual outside entrances, and it looked surprisingly clean from the road. The parking lot was well lit, and the building, while dated, didn't have that abandoned or sketchy feel some roadside motels do. Inside the small office, a man in his 40s was working the desk. He seemed genuinely surprised to see a new guest arrive at that time of night. He was average height and built reasonably attractive and very polite. He explained that his grandfather had actually built this hotel back in the 1960s during the free love era, which was why the rooms were still decorated in a retro 60s style. He said he had taken over the operation a few years earlier and mentioned he'd previously been a highway patrol officer who'd been injured on duty, which is how he ended up running a motel instead of being out on the road. He assigned me room 7, located far enough from the ice and vending machines to be quiet, but positioned so that I had a clear view of the front office, and he could keep an eye on my car. I never got any creepy vibes from him, so I took the room without hesitation. The rate for a double was cheap, so I checked in, took the physical key, and headed over. There were 5 other cars in the lot, and I figured one of them had to belong to the owner, which meant there were 4 other guests scattered around the property. I could see that rooms 4 and 10 each had a car parked directly outside, spaced out just enough that no one felt on top of anyone else. I grabbed my overnight bag and went into my room, and it looked exactly like he'd described, pure 1960s. I hadn't expected it to be so clean and well maintained. There was a full little kitchenette along one wall with a compact 2-burner stovetop, a small oven, a microwave, and a mini fridge, all neatly arranged. The bed had an orange bedspread with crisp white sheets underneath, no stains on the mattress, no suspicious marks, and thankfully no bed bugs. The furniture was dark panelled wood. The tan carpet was surprisingly intact, and the walls were covered in orange, green, and brown paper with funky swirl patterns straight out of an old catalogue. The cabinets even held basic dishes and a set of pots and pans, which made it pretty clear the place could be rented for long-term stays if needed. It was different and quirky in a cool way. I unpacked a little, took a hot shower, and then called the front desk to ask about any restaurants that might still be open. He told me there was a 24-hour cafe a few miles up the road that served good food and good coffee. But there wasn't any delivery service, so I'd have to go and pick it up myself, which wasn't a problem, and after getting a few suggestions from him, I phoned in my order, drove over, picked it up, and about 15 minutes later was driving back with food in my car. I took it to the room, sat down to eat, and ate like I hadn't eaten food in several days, and still had enough leftovers to stash in the fridge for lunch the next day. And that's when things started getting strange. After I had finished eating, I put the leftovers neatly into the fridge and headed into the bathroom to brush my teeth. When I stepped in, my toiletries bag wasn't on the counter where I was sure I'd left it, and none of my personal items were in their usual place. The realization made my skin crawl a little, because I clearly remembered putting everything away when I unpacked, and that included setting my bag right on the bathroom counter. Thinking I might be more tired than I realized, I went around the room and found my bag sitting on the floor next to the bed. I picked it up, pulled out my toothbrush and toothpaste and went to the bathroom, brushed my teeth, washed my face, and was trying to convince myself I'd absent-mindedly moved it earlier and simply forgotten. Then I turned in for the night. I must have been asleep for about an hour when someone knocked on my door. It startled me enough that for a second I thought it might be part of a dream, but then the knock came a second time, louder and clearer. I got up, went to the window, and saw a young woman sitting outside. She was thin with long blonde hair and appeared to be in her early 20s. I spoke through the closed door and asked her what she wanted. She said she needed to use my phone. I told her no, and she should go to the front desk instead. She glanced around but never looked directly at me, even though I was clearly watching her through the window. She turned to her right and walked out of view towards the office. I may not be a kid anymore, but I'm not stupid. That old "can I use your phone" trick is one of the classic ways people try to get you to open your door, and I wasn't about to fall for it. I called the front desk and talked to the owner, who introduced himself as Paul, and told him a young blonde woman had just knocked on my door and asked to use my phone, and that I had refused and sent her towards the office. He paused before answering and then said he was outside, standing by his car, smoking, and hadn't seen anyone walking around. He told me to look out my window at the office, and when I peeked through the curtain, he was there next to a Jeep, cigarette in one hand, phone in the other. He asked me to describe her and said he kept an eye out in case she showed up again, adding that there were a few homeless drug addicts in the area who moved fast if they were turned away and could disappear pretty quickly. I also mentioned the toiletries bag incident and asked if anyone might have come into my room while I was gone earlier. He said that would be difficult, as the room still used traditional keys, and the only other key was supposedly on his keyring, which he showed me was clipped on his belt loop. He swore he hadn't been in my room, but said he'd check the security cameras and let me know in the morning if he saw anything. Since nothing was actually missing, just moved, I thanked him and went back to bed, telling myself fatigue was making me feel stranger than things really were. I don't know how much time passed before I woke up again, but this time it was because I felt someone or something sit down on the bed. At first I thought I was slowly sliding off the mattress, but then I realized there was a distinct dip forming behind me, like weight was being applied in one spot near my lower back. The temperature along my spine dropped sharply, and I could feel the covers shifting as if someone was pulling the sheets up. Then a cold hand settled on my right hip. My entire body locked up. I mean, literally froze. 1,000 questions shot through my mind at once. How did anyone get into my room with the door locked and the deadbolt on? Was it Paul? Had he somehow used his key and slipped in without me waking? Was it the girl from earlier? I couldn't tell if the presence was male or female, only that it was real and close. Terror grabbed a hold. Cold sweat formed on my upper lip and crossed my forehead. My heart felt like it had climbed into my throat, beating so hard I could barely breathe. I started to shiver, not just from the cold on my back, but from pure panic. And then I heard a faint, unmistakable voice right behind me. "You're warm. I like this." I eased my hand under my pillow and wrapped my fingers around my 9mm Glock. In one motion, I screamed at the top of my lungs, threw the covers off, jumped up, and fired 2 shots straight down into the mattress where the pressure had been. Then I scrambled for the light switch, flicked it on, and froze. There was no one there. Just 2 smoking, blackened holes in the bed where the bullets had gone in. I checked under the bed, in the bathroom, every corner of that small room, and there was nothing and no one. When I finally went to the door and checked it, the deadbolt was still engaged, and the door was still locked from the inside. According to that, no one had entered. But something had been in that bed with me. A pounding on the door stepped me out of my gaze. I opened it to find Paul standing there with a gun in hand, looking wide awake and serious. I quickly told him what happened, and he walked me over to the office. On my way, a man from room 4 stepped outside looking disheveled and annoyed about being woken by gunshots. Paul spoke to him quietly, and the man went back to his room. Inside the office, Paul poured me a shot of whiskey, which I gracefully accepted. He then told me he had something important to show me on CCTV. He had already rolled the recording back to the time I arrived and had been scanning through it. On the screen, we watched me pull into the lot, go into the office, chat with him, check in, and then head into my room. About half an hour later, he pointed out my car leaving and coming back from the cafe 17 minutes later. You could see me get up with the food and coffee, go to my room and close the door. About an hour later, the recording showed him stepping outside, lighting a cigarette, and leaning against his Jeep. Then you could see my room's curtains move as I looked out the window. From the camera's perspective, there was no one standing at my door when I drew the curtains open. No woman, no person at all. What there was, though, was a faint little orb of light drifting into view, moving along the walkway from further down and hovering just outside my door. It might have been a bug catching the light, but the timing was uncanny. After a few seconds, it blinked out of sight, and on the video, I soon moved away from the window. You could see Paul answer his phone, presumably my call. And a moment later, I reappeared at the window and he waved up to my room. He went outside, I closed the curtains, and that's when I tried to go to sleep. He then jumped ahead to around 3:17 a.m. and pointed at the screen. The orb reappeared in the camera's field of view. Brighter this time, it drifted up to my door, but instead of winking out, it seemed to turn slightly and then vanish into the door itself, as though passing directly through it. What had felt to me like an eternity, the presence, the voice, my reaction, only took about 3 minutes of footage. After that, you could see 2 faint but clearly visible flashes of light behind my drawn curtains, which matched the 2 gunshots I'd fired into the mattress. Then the video showed Paul sprinting out of the office with his gun drawn, running straight towards my room. The rest of the story, of course, played out in real time from there. My head was spinning as we sat there in that small office watching the replay. We both sat silently for a while, listening to the clock tick, neither of us sure what to say. Paul eventually got up, poured us another shot of whiskey, and I drank it as quickly as the first, feeling the burn move slowly down my throat into my stomach. He asked what I thought the orb was. I told him that's what people usually call them, orbs, and that while it could technically be a bug or some dust reflecting on the camera's light, it struck me as far too coincidental that it showed up exactly when my experiences happened. He said he didn't really believe in coincidence. I admitted that I thought it might be something ghostly. He countered that no one had died in that particular room as far as he knew, and that he'd never heard any other guest report anything like this. I apologized for shooting the mattress and promised to pay for it. He said he'd gladly take the compensation and offered to move me to another room, asking that I promise not to shoot that one up. I laughed weakly but declined the offer. I just wanted to leave. We exchanged information, and I told him to charge the mattress to my credit card, and after he ran it, he gave me directions to the nearest national park campsite, and I went back to the room to pack. It was quiet when I walked back in, but I still moved quickly, eager to be out of there. I grabbed my bag, my leftovers from the fridge, and my other belongings, then returned the key to Paul, shook his hand, and got back to my car. The moment I pulled out of that parking lot, it felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I was more than ready to get to my campsite and leave that little roadside Bates Motel experience behind. I still think of that place from time to time. I wonder if Paul has had any more complaints about strange visitors, moving items, or unseen bedmates. I'll probably never know exactly what caused those things to happen that night, but I do know that from now on I'll take my chances with whatever goes bump in the night at the campsite. Bears and drunks I can handle, whereas ghosts, not so much. Let me preface this by saying I do believe in the supernatural myself, but consider myself generally skeptical on a case-by-case basis. I myself have not had any supernatural experiences in this room, so everything I say will be second-hand at best. For reference, I work at a small 40-ish room motel in the Midwest, in a relatively small college town. We're on the lower end of the budget in town, but much nicer than the other low-budget properties nearby, so we tend to serve people like the college students and their families, as well as pilot cars, truckers, and a handful of long-term contractors. We also acted to help quarantine college students during the pandemic, which is when I was hired in 2021. I have only one other worker at the front desk, an elderly woman called Trish. She's been working here since before I was born, and coincidentally has been working here through the location's past 3 owners and name changes. Currently, our hotel is owned by a man called Mr. Smith. Trish is Catholic, Smith is Hindu, and I am a Protestant. This religious information is relevant to later. In 2021, we had blocked out the entire 2nd floor to be used by the college for housing for their COVID quarantine. They also stationed an RA there called Andy. Shortly after I started the job, we had a girl come in from the university for her quarantine. I went through the quarantine procedures with her, gave her a goodie bag Mr. Smith had made for the students, and the key to room 206. A short while later, she returned and said the room smelled awful and like something had died in there. Insisted it was like rotting meat. I thought this was strange because we disinfected all the quarantine rooms thoroughly after each stay, to the point where they only smelled like disinfectant, and did so strongly. But we had lots of rooms for the students available, so I moved her to a different one and called Mr. Smith to let him know, and he asked me if I would check the room and sanitize it just in case. So I put on the gear and went up to the room. I didn't smell anything bad at all, but I also didn't smell the disinfectant either, so I sprayed the room again and left and didn't think much of it. A few months later, after the college quarantine period was over and we had our whole property back. At this time I was training a new hire on the overnight shift. Trish or I would do the audit first thing in the morning, and I was staying in 101 right off the lobby so that the new hire could come and ask for help if needed, and I could sleep. I had another job at the time as well, so I was effectively working 2 8-hour jobs 5 times a week. It was rough. One evening, a weekend if I recall, I checked a guest into 205, a sweet middle-aged woman. Everything seemed fine. She'd been in a few times before, and when the overnighter came in, there were no issues and I went to bed, hoping I'd get a full night's sleep. I never once did get a full night's sleep during this period, but it's always nice to hope. Around 3:30 in the morning, the phone in my room rings. It's the overnighter telling me he has a guest with a complaint, and he doesn't know what to do. He tells me that the woman at the desk is asking to be moved because someone in the next room is banging. Our overnighter's first language was not English, so I wasn't sure what this meant, but decided I'd shamble up to the counter in my pajamas at 3 in the morning. The guest, to her credit, apologized profusely, and said she didn't need any credit or help, she just wanted to be moved out of 206. It was at this moment I remembered the earlier incident, and became interested. I asked her what was going on, and she said, "It's as if there's a person in the next room going through a very troubling time. I tried to knock on their door to comfort them, but they wouldn't answer. They're just sobbing and hitting the wall." I was perplexed, because I was looking at our card slot. We still used cards to check in guests, and I could plainly see that no one was staying in 206, assuming the overnighter had done his job properly. I didn't say this to the guest though, just apologized and moved her to a corner suite. We didn't have any other rooms of her type available beside 206, and I wasn't about to move her into the room she swore was having a meltdown. She thanked us repeatedly and left for the night, and we didn't hear from her again. The next morning Trish showed up, and recalling the first mini-story, I asked her what the deal was with 206. She gave me a forlorn look and said, "Oh, is it still happening?" I raised my eyebrow and asked what that meant. She gave me a long sigh and went about preparing breakfast. I had to be at my next job at 8, but I was eager to hear the explanation, so I helped her set up while she explained. "A few years ago, a man took his life in 206. Geez, did you find the body?" Trish nodded and continued. "Yeah, well, sort of. The cleaning ladies found him first as usual, but I had to show the police and supervise them, cleaning up. I've seen people die here before, but never in such a messy way. Looked like he'd used a shotgun to take his head off." "That's awful," I said. "Did we make the head housekeeper clean that up?" "No, thankfully the police gave us a phone number to call when we hired some professionals. There was a lot of blood and other stuff on the wall and bed. We had to replace the bed, I think. Anyway, after that happened, there was about a week where the guests in the neighbouring rooms would report that someone was in the room and in distress and wouldn't open up. Of course, there's nobody in the room because we were renovating it at the time. It got to the point where I decided to call in a priest, and he came to visit the room and said nothing was wrong. I'm not sure what he might have done to it, but I haven't had many problems since then. Occasionally someone reports a disturbance and I tell them I'll give them a warning, and it seems to go away. A couple of months ago, one of the college students told me it smelled like rotting meat when I checked her in, so I moved her to a new room. Did anyone else describe that to you? Trish frowned and shook her head. No, I don't think so. But I don't know for sure. My memory's not what it used to, but I wouldn't be surprised. That room is haunted for sure. I hadn't known Trish long at that time, but looking back, I can confidently say she believed that, and was not, as my mum put it, trying to BS me. The last encounter was probably a year or so ago. My father was visiting for a few days, and while he isn't a priest, he is very involved in his church and has a lot of education in that area. He, for the record, does not believe in hauntings. On top of this, he asked for the room type of 206, and we have only 4 of those, so I gave him that room. I figured he doesn't believe in it, so either he will now or it wouldn't be a problem. Perhaps a dick move of me, but I'd never heard of anyone actually having harm done to them, so I didn't think it would be a problem. He checked in and was due to stay for 3 or 4 days, and after the first night I asked him, "Hey Dad, how was your night?" I always ask this as a courtesy whenever any of my family stays, but obviously I had an ulterior motive here. My dad replies that it was fine, the bed was comfy, and he had to turn the AC off though because it was pretty cold. I asked if it warmed up after that and he just said it did. Dad was there for another few nights and didn't mention any problems with the room, until the last day after he'd already checked out. We were in a chain diner for breakfast and he asked for coffee. I remarked on this. He doesn't usually drink coffee and he responds, "I haven't been sleeping so well." I was a bit taken aback and did not think of the potential haunting anymore, and at that point I was like, "I asked you every morning how your night was and you always said it was fine." Dad nodded enthusiastically and said, "Oh, the room was fine. I just felt, not great. At night I had the same nightmare a few nights in a row." Dad does not usually talk about his emotions at all. I sometimes doubt he has them at all. So I was immediately thinking about Trish's explanation. I couldn't help myself and blurted out, "Trish said that room's haunted." Dad rolled his eyes and chuckled. "So you gave it to me, huh?" He didn't talk about the recurring nightmare anymore, and he hasn't brought it up since, but ever since then, I have been convinced 206 is haunted. I did try staying in that room one night myself. The building was being fumigated, but I didn't have any out of the ordinary experiences at all. Trish says this is because the ghosts fade away over time. Mr. Smith said not to tell guests any of the rooms were haunted. I didn't think he believes they are either, but he's got a little Hindu god at the front of the desk that I was told was a prosperity god of some kind, and he religiously rubs it any time he goes in or out. And that does it for me, folks. If there are any developments, I'll be sure to let you know. If anyone else has ever worked in a haunted hotel, I'd be very curious to hear it. My first job was at an old hotel that had been renovated and turned into a franchise spot. But you could still tell that it used to be something else. It even had a fancy historic name attached to it, something like the Old Regency Lodge, even though it was now just another chain off the highway. I worked there as a cook in the kitchen bar. My aunt also worked there, but she handled breakfast in the very early mornings. That meant she was alone at dawn setting up the buffet, and I was alone in the late evenings cooking bar food and cleaning up for the night. About 4 months into me working there, the hotel temporarily lost its liquor license. The bar shut down completely, but I still had to come in every morning, so for 6 hours straight, I'd be in a massive, quiet kitchen with maybe 5 orders total, and half of those were for hotel staff. And that's when things began to get uncomfortable. First off, the basement. Our clock-in room was down there, along with storage rooms and some kind of religious shrine the owners had set up. The ceilings were low, the lighting was dim, and a lot of it still looked original, with old stone walls and pipes running overhead. That area still had not been renovated. There were also old elevator shafts down there that had been boarded up and chained off in the laziest way possible. Beyond those were several empty rooms and long hallways I had never explored. Every single night when I'd clock out, I would get this overwhelming sense of dread. The best way I can describe it is that feeling you had as a kid when you'd sneak downstairs in the dark to grab a snack. I'd swipe my card, hear the beep, and practically sprint back to the elevator. But the worst area wasn't the basement. The kitchen connected directly to the hotel's ballroom, which were massive and usually empty during the week. There was a narrow, dark hallway that staff had to use to take out trash or dump fryer oil. At the very end was a door leading outside to the dumpster. I hated that hallway. Sometimes the staff entrance doors to the ballroom would be left open, and I swear every time they were, I felt uncomfortable. The ballrooms weren't pitch black. You could usually see the far walls and stacks of chairs pushed to the side, but on certain nights there would be this strange wall of darkness close to the doorway. I could still see the chairs and wall beyond it, but the space in front of them looked unnaturally dark, like a shadow with depth. It made my stomach drop every time. Eventually I stopped looking in that direction altogether, and just stared straight ahead whenever I passed through the hallway. But now for the real stuff I can't explain. There was a swinging door that would connect the bar area to the kitchen. One of the bartenders, called Megan, would come through it all the time to grab beers from the freezers in the back. At least 5 or 6 times, I clearly saw someone, a full human-shaped figure, push open the door and walk into the kitchen. I'd be cooking while listening to a podcast or audiobook with one earbud in. When I'd see Megan come in, I'd pause what I was listening to so that we could chat for a while. I'd wait, and wait, and wait, and after a bit I'd call out, "Megan?" to no answer. So I'd walk back to where the freezers were and there'd be no one. The kitchen would be completely empty. There was no way she could have left without me seeing her because the swinging door is directly in my line of sight. The figure always moved naturally too, not like a shadow flicker or trick of the light. It looked like a person casually walking in. Each time it happened, I brushed it off and told myself I must have imagined it. I never brought it up to Megan because I'd already felt weirded out enough working alone in that creepy place. But that wasn't all. While working there, I'd randomly start thinking about my grandfather. He wasn't really present in my life growing up, and honestly I rarely thought about him at all. But in the kitchen, memories of him would come and hit me out of nowhere, vivid and detailed, like I was reliving moments instead of remembering them. Sometimes I'd go sit in the kitchen manager's office on my break and suddenly get hit by a very strong smell my grandfather sent. Not just cologne, but that specific mix of cologne and work materials. He used to do handyman work and construction work and always smelled faintly like wood and dust and whatever he'd been repairing that day. It made no sense. My manager was a woman and always left hours before my shift started. No men worked there in the evening, and the smell would come in thick waves, like someone had just walked past me. What made it stranger still was the feeling that came with it wasn't scary but warm and comforting, almost nostalgic. Eventually one day, my aunt and I were talking about work, and somehow the topic of weird stuff came up. That conversation gave me chills. I mentioned the overwhelming feeling in the basement, the dark presence near the ballroom, the figure I kept seeing in the kitchen, and the random memories and smells of my grandfather, and her face went pale. She slowly told me she had experienced almost exactly the same thing. She said she'd randomly smell her own father's house while working breakfast shift. He used to burn wood in a stove, and the smell would cling to everything, and sometimes it would come out of nowhere in the empty kitchen. She also talked about feeling watched in certain parts of the hotel, especially near the ballroom and downstairs. We were literally finishing each other's sentences. What stood out was that both of us felt the same emotional difference between the presences. Whatever was around the kitchen and bar area felt gentle, almost protective, like a fatherly energy. But the thing near the ballrooms and the basement felt sinister, like something you didn't want there. Neither of us had gone looking for those experiences. They just happened casually, and we would shrug them off like, well, that was weird, and move on. Talking about them out loud was when we finally connected the dots. I genuinely believe there are at least two entities in this hotel, one that's warm and familiar, and a dark one that lingers in the older parts of the building. There are probably more things that happened that I can't remember anymore, but those are the ones that impacted me the most. I've never really been a hardcore believer in the paranormal even after all of this, but there was definitely something haunting that hotel. My husband and I were renting an Airbnb for a few nights. It was basically a mother-in-law suite. It was literally one room on a solid concrete foundation. The first night we were getting ready for bed and heard a loud growl from outside the window. We immediately looked out the window, and when we saw nothing, my husband went outside to look and still saw nothing. The next night we were just chilling, not thinking about this at all. We were both reading with no TV on or anything, and then the loudest, deepest growl I ever heard came from directly under the bed. The sound came from inside the room. We immediately freaked out and flipped the mattress, but there's nothing there. There's nowhere else in this room for anything to be. The next morning I went outside and inspected this little house thoroughly. There was no way for anything to be under the house, no crawl space or above. I told the lady who owned the property what we heard and asked if there had been any wild animals in the area that could make the sound. She said no. I googled this. Google said no. I've worked with dogs professionally for years. Not even the biggest dog could growl that deeply, let alone hide unseen in our room. Sometimes I'll be chilling in bed and remember this and still feel the pure terror that I did that night. It was late August in Nelson, British Columbia, when my family travelled for a regatta on the beautiful Kootenay Lake. My sister Elizabeth, my father and I drove our beat-up Dodge Dakota through winding mountain roads into town. The air was warm, and the haze from distant wildfires drifted over the hills, carrying the sweet, acrid scent of burning pine. Mountains rose around us like dark sentinels, and sunlight pierced through the canopy of slanting beams, spilling over the highway, guiding us towards the lake. Nelson appeared suddenly, a small city cradled between water and mountains, a once quaint and commanding place. Heritage buildings of brick and stone lined the narrow streets. We were tired from the drive and eager for dinner, but I remember even then feeling the building's imperceptible presence. Our room was a standard two-queen layout. When you entered, the bathroom door sat directly ahead. To the left was the bed my sister and I shared. To the right was my father's. The bathroom created a sort of dividing corridor, with just enough space to feel separate from one another. We unpacked, each of us taking turns in the bathroom. My father was ready first and left to meet our rowing coach, Martin, in the lobby. My sister straightened her hair in the bathroom, and I sat at the desk, writing a letter to my boyfriend at boot camp. That's when I heard the first knock. It was polite, just 3 taps, enough to make me think my father had forgotten his key already, and I rose and opened the door and stared into an empty hallway. The corridor stretched both ways, which was still, with not a single other door open. I couldn't hear retreating footsteps nor see anyone out there, and I frowned, closing the door, and told myself it must have just been my sister bumping something in the bathroom. When she emerged, dressed and ready, I told her I'd be down shortly, and she left with her key alone. I finished sealing the envelope when a second knock came. This time it was louder and insistent. A cold ripple of unease crept down my back. My sister had her key. My father was with Martin. Why knock, and why twice? I pressed my eye to the peephole, and I couldn't see anything. The hallway was utterly empty. There was no motion or sound. But all the same, I opened the door a crack, peeking out. Still nothing. My heart thudded as I stepped back into the room. I told myself I was imagining it, grabbed my bag, and hurried down to meet the others. My father and Martin went to the lounge after, leaving my sister and me to return to our rooms. We slipped into bed, stomachs full, and that's when the faintest scratching started from inside the bathroom wall. It was soft at first, like the sound of mice, and we whispered back and forth, convincing ourselves that's all it was, until we fell into a restless sleep. I dreamed all night, but could not wake from it. Murky, oppressive nightmares evaporated by morning, leaving only an uncomfortable feeling in my chest. My sister was tired, and she told me that she had heard footsteps pacing outside our door throughout the night. Our father chuckled when we asked if he'd noticed anything, brushing it off as his CPAP machine drowned out any sound. The next day passed like a reprieve. We spent it at the lake, prepping boats and preparing for races the next day, and after prep was finished, a couple of teammates, my family and I, went on an outing to explore the town. Nelson's shops and cafes were bright and inviting, a world away from the hotel. But that evening, after a team dinner at an Italian restaurant, our unease returned. We opened our hotel room door to a sight that made us cold. Every pillow in the room, from our beds to the chairs, had been arranged in a perfect circle on my father's bed. In the center of the circle stood one long, cylindrical pillow, balanced upright as if by unseen forces. The soft mattress should have made it impossible, but there it was, defying both gravity and logic. For a moment we said nothing, staring. Then my father exhaled sharply and began putting the pillows back. We were too tired to argue with him. That night I couldn't sleep at all. I was listening to the faint sounds of the footsteps pacing up and down the hallway. The next morning was race day. We fled the hotel early, spent the day at the lake, and were exhausted but triumphant, staying out until nightfall and celebrating with teammates. But each time we returned to the hotel, my sister and I felt it pressing on us. The sense that something unseen did not approve of our presence. Our final morning after breakfast at the hotel's general store restaurant, curiosity got the best of us, and we asked our server if the hotel was haunted. Her face lit up. She told us of renovations stirring up activity, of a maid whose cleaning cart had been thrown across the hallway, of guests talking about unseen hands, leaving scratches that were impossible to inflict. We were relieved, strangely, to know that we were not alone in our experiences. And when we left the hotel later that day and drove out of town, Nelson looked as serene as it had when we'd first arrived, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the hotel still had other guests to torment. I'm just glad I wouldn't be in their number. I am currently trying to sleep outside the Farnsworth Inn in my car. I'm parked in the lot with the seat pushed back, with my boyfriend snoring on the passenger side. I'm still too wired to even close my eyes. Before I can get into what happened tonight, I will need to give you a bit of background, so what I'm about to say doesn't sound completely ridiculous. My boyfriend and I both grew up in genuinely haunted houses. His childhood home was serious enough that it was investigated and eventually exorcised, while mine was a creaky over 200-year-old house where strange things were just a part of the everyday life. Because of that, both of us consider ourselves pretty sensitive to paranormal activity, and and not easily spooked by every random noise or cold draft. Tonight though, whatever is in this place really pushed that sensitivity to the limit. We checked into the Sarah Black room earlier in the afternoon. As soon as we walked in with our overnight bags and shut the door behind us, I felt something brush along the back of my neck and down the upper part of my back, like a light, deliberate pass of air or fingers. I tried to brush it off as the air conditioner kicking on, or my nerves reacting to finally being in a famous haunted inn, and told myself not to overreact before anything actually happened. After settling in a bit, we took out some of our ghost hunting equipment. The spirit box, a little dead bell, and a couple of cat toys with motion-activated lights that we set carefully in a drawer and on the floor to use as simple detectors. Around 4 p.m, nothing particularly dramatic happened with any of them. The occasional door handle jiggled, or distant creaks that echoed through the walls, but we chalked that up to other guest doors closing, the old wooden structures shifting, as well as the normal hotel noise that just travels through an old shared building. Well, right before dinner at around 5 p.m, I went into the small bathroom to use the toilet and wash my hands. While I was standing at the sink, the cat ball we'd put on the vanity across from me suddenly lit up and started flashing repeatedly. It sat there rolling and blinking like something had tapped it, even though it was on the other side of the room, and nothing else was moving. When it finally stopped, I walked over to it, trying to find a rational explanation. I touched the vanity, shook the desk a bit, and walked around the ball. I even bounced on my toes a few times to see if vibrations from my movement would set it off again. It stayed completely still and dark, no matter what I tried. Later, during the cellar tour, we found that this was reportedly the exact spot where a man named Jeremy died, and that bit of information lodged itself firmly in the back of my mind for the rest of the night. After dinner and the tour, we got back to the room, opened a bottle of wine, and pulled out our equipment again. We ran the spirit box for a while, listening for clear responses or unusual interference, but nothing particularly strong or convincing came through. I guess you could say we were slightly disappointed but also relieved, and we decided to start getting ready for bed. And that's when everything changed. I suddenly caught a strong, distinct waft of perfume. It smelled like an older, floral fragrance, nothing like what I wear, and it came out of nowhere in the middle of the room. At that exact moment, the cat ball on the floor lit up and began flashing furiously, and the dead bell, which hadn't made a sound all evening, started to ring in clear, chiming bursts. We panicked a bit and started bugging out, talking too fast, my nerves spiking while my boyfriend was already exhausted and clearly dumb with my constant commentary, told me a bit impatiently to close my eyes and go to sleep, insisting that I would be working myself up over nothing. By about 11:30, he was in a deep, heavy sleep, snoring steadily beside me while I lay awake, head under the covers trying to shut out the room and calm down. That was when I started hearing dragging sounds from somewhere above us, in what I assumed to be the attic space. It sounded like someone slowly dragging something across a rough floor, then setting it down, and then dragging it again. My heart started pounding as I listened to it repeat a few times. Then I distinguished footsteps out in the hallway. They were slow, measured steps that came and went near our door. I shook my boyfriend awake and told him what I was hearing. He groggily repeated the same line, so just to go to sleep and stop listening too hard and try not to think about it. And eventually the sounds died down enough that I managed to drift off for a short while. Around 12:30 a.m. I woke up again, this time to the same sudden perfume, smell, and a sense that something was different in the room. I lifted my head and checked the clock. The cat ball on the floor was going off non-stop, flashing steadily as if someone were tapping it again and again. I also really had to pee, but I was terrified of leaving the relative safety of the bed. I lay there arguing with myself for a while until 1 a.m., when I finally mustered the courage to get up. My boyfriend had it much worse in his childhood home, and tends to shrug a lot of this off, but it was genuinely bugging me because I didn't know these particular spirits and had no idea how they behave. As I walked past the cat ball on my way to the bathroom, nothing I did set it off. It was completely dark and still, which somehow made it creepier, given how active it had just been. I used the bathroom quickly as I hurried back into bed. At around 1:45, I heard footsteps again outside the door. That same steady pace up and down the hallway. My nerves were shot by then, but I was curious and stupid enough to try an invitation, and I called out, "If there is anyone with us now, set the cat ball off." And almost immediately, it started flashing like crazy, lighting up in frantic bursts on the floor. That was my breaking point for that stretch. I shook my boyfriend awake and told him what had happened. He could see I was really scared, so he stayed up with me until I finally drifted off again, even if he still didn't seem completely convinced anything serious was going on. Sometime around 3 a.m. our roles reversed. I was finally asleep, exhausted and oblivious while my boyfriend lay awake in the dark. He later told me that he heard 6 very loud, hard knocks on our door in a row, followed by the sound of someone pushing or rushing against it, as if trying to repeatedly force their way into the room. He said it sounded like whoever or whatever it was throwing its weight against the 3 separate locks on the door, testing them one by one. Then the doorknob started turning and rattling like someone was absolutely determined to get inside. He was lying there wide-eyed, trying to calm himself down and rationalize what was happening. But he didn't wake me up because he knew I would completely freak out, and he didn't want to escalate the panic. Eventually the knob stopped moving, and the knocking ceased. Just when he thought it might be over, he said the entire bed suddenly yanked and shook in one clean, powerful motion, like something had grabbed the frame and given it a hard single jerk. When he checked the time, it was about 3:35 a.m., and from then on he heard the door, noises and footsteps continue off and on again as the hallway activity carried on outside. I woke up around then, as he was finally starting to doze off, and the first thing I noticed were the footsteps in the hall pacing back and forth outside our room. I immediately started freaking out, and that's when he told me very calmly what he had just experienced with the knocks, the door handle, and the bed shaking. Hearing that he'd gone through all of that and stayed relatively unfazed while I slept on only added to the sickening feeling in my stomach. No matter how composed he tried to be, those are not the kind of things you brush off easily. By about 4 a.m., I'd hit my limit, finding out there had been 6 heavy knocks, attempts at the door, and a violent bed shake on top of everything else pushed me over the edge. I decided I wasn't going to lie there and wait to see if something was sitting at the end of our bed or looming over me. The number of knocks and the intensity of the shaking felt unmistakably malevolent to me, not just playful or curious. I'm sure I'd irritated him with my fear and constant what-ifs, and he was definitely exhausted by then, but I told him plainly that I was done. I wasn't comfortable in that room anymore, and I was heading out to the car to try to sleep somewhere that at least had a locked metal shell around us instead of an antique wooden door that something had already tried to test. Now it's almost 8 a.m., and instead of waking up in a historic cozy room at the Farnsworth Inn, I'm parked outside in the chilly morning air, typing this all out on my phone while my boyfriend sleeps in the passenger seat, finally catching some rest. I'm severely sleep deprived, my nerves are shot, and I'm sure some of this might come across as jumbled, but that's my chaotic night. If anyone needs clarification or anything, just let me know. I just needed to get this all off my chest. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed tonight's stay at the Haunted Hotels. If you did, you can let me know down below. I'd like to extend a huge thank you, as always, to our members and patrons, whose names can be seen on screen. And if you'd like some additional perks, feel free to follow the link down below to find out more. But that's it from me, and I'll see you on Thursday for even more scary stories. Until next time, stay awesome, and good night. Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight I have a collection of haunted hospital stories for you to enjoy. So for now, get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I served in the Navy at Fort Belver's old Army base hospital. It's a sprawling 5-story relic from World War II, where only the first and second floors stayed active for patient care, while the upper levels sat sealed as storage, crammed with extra chairs, discarded gurneys, obsolete medical carts gathering dust. You get the picture. One afternoon, my sailor buddy and I climbed past the authorized personnel only signs taped crookedly on the fire doors to hunt an extra chair on one of those deserted floors, the former birthing ward and nursery level. We strode down the corridor when a room doorway caught us mid-stride. The walls were a fading pastel color, and I observed an old wooden rocking chair sat centered. We both froze mid-step, exchanging quick glances, and I said, "Did you see that?" My buddy nodded slowly, eyes wide. "Was someone sitting in the rocker?" I agreed. I'd glimpsed the same vague silhouette, swaying the rocker gently, and the figure hunched forward as if cradling something close, but curiosity pulled us back for a closer look. Empty chair, still a stone. There were no creaking or springs or retreating footsteps fading down the hall. No one else on the entire floor, since staff avoided it beyond rare supply runs. We chalked it up to a trick of the light, or fatigue from long shifts, shrugged, grabbed our chair from another room and headed down. Weeks later, we returned for cables, passing that same doorway again. A handwritten note was now taped to the rocker's slats, and it caught my eye. "Please do not use or remove," was written in blocky marker. Odd enough to flag my boss, which I did, who we disrupted while he was looking at a chart, and he gave us a grim look. "Ah, mothers used it to rock their stillborns. They'd hold 'em close one last time, before letting 'em go down to the morgue." Our mind was blown. Had we caught the spirit of a grieving mother there? Form blurred from days past? I think that confirmed the place was haunted. Much to my despair, tragedy struck after that. That sailor took his own life not long past our transfer to the gleaming new hospital across base. I'm not claiming the rocker is in any way connected, but witnessing my partner vanish from us forever affected me in ways I can't even put into words. My mother works as a radiologist in a public hospital in Catalonia, Spain, where she encountered an unsettling incident. This is back in December of 2019, and it still lingers in her memory. She told me this story today, and I found it deeply disturbing, given her overall good health and lack of any mental illness that could explain away such events. So her friend had just finished a mammography in the imaging area, so my mother stepped into the adjacent room 4 to review the images on the computer, while closing the heavy lead-lined doors behind her to block any stray ionizing radiation from reaching the hallway beyond. No more than 30 seconds passed before the doorknob began turning violently, as if someone had gripped it hard from the outside and shook the entire frame with urgent force, prompting her to call out, "Come in," while assuming it must be her friend ready to ask her questions or share an update. But the knob kept rattling insistently, despite her shout, leading her to yell even louder, "Come on in," with growing irritation at what suddenly seemed like rudeness from whoever stood still just beyond the barrier, until she suddenly remembered her friend could not possibly be there, since she had only just begun putting her clothes back on after the procedure, with no time elapsing for such a quick exchange. A strange certainty washed over her that nothing waited behind that door when she finally twisted the door handle for herself and opened it, revealing nothing but an empty hallway. Other disturbances have plagued the same room, number 4, over time as well, including one night when my mother sat with 2 fellow doctors reviewing scans, and one co-worker watched an echography gel bottle launch itself at extreme speed straight into the nearest wall, despite all 3 of them remaining the only people present in the space. A colleague has since confided that something feels profoundly wrong with the entire floor where the events cluster, leaving me uncertain about what truly haunts that specific corner of the hospital. Around 2004, I took my then fiancé to the Don Cesar for an extended weekend getaway. This is a very old hotel that used to be a mental hospital for some years after its initial heyday as a grand resort. After that, it was vacant for some time before being renovated and reopened as a hospital. Now, I am highly allergic to cigarette smoke and had reserved a non-smoking room. Although we arrived after our check-in time, our room was not ready. We were invited to wait in the bar and were comped with some cocktails while we waited. After about 45 minutes, the concierge came by and told us our room was ready. We get up to our room, and as soon as we walk in, I could tell someone had recently smoked in it, and I immediately began to have an allergic reaction and told my future wife not to even unpack, as I would need to get us another room. So I went to the front desk and told them that there was a strong cigarette odor in the room and that we would not be able to stay in it. My message was relayed to the manager on duty, and he came out to speak with me. He seemed to really want to keep me in the room they had given me, offering me to treat it with air and carpet freshener, but I explained that it was a medical issue and that I had to have a non-smoking room. We ended up waiting another 45 minutes or so while another room was prepared. I was pleased when we got to it because the room offered a lovely view of the water and beach, and there was no discernible trace of cigarette smoke. There was a ceiling fan in the room controlled by a wall switch, with settings for 3 speeds and off. Before we went to bed, I had set the fan on the lowest speed. Around 2 a.m. I awoke, with a feeling that something was amiss. The air conditioner was running, but the room felt much colder than it should have, and the ceiling fan that had been slowly turning when I went to sleep was now turning as if it was on high. My fiancé was sleeping through all of this, but as I lay there on the bed, the ceiling fan began turning faster and faster. It got to the point that it was turning so fast it seemed it would break loose and go spinning away. Finally, I got out of bed to turn it off, but even after turning it off, the fan kept running at breakneck speed. I went back to bed and began silently praying in opposition of whatever was causing the fan to run. As I prayed, the fan began to slow down. Even though it was still turned off, I fell asleep. When I awoke, it was daylight and the fan was not running. We began getting showered and dressed, and I made no mention of the ceiling fan to my fiancé. And while I was in the bathroom shaving, I distinctly heard a voice from the other side of the bathroom wall yell, "Get me out of here!" I later checked to see if there was another room abutting the bathroom of our room, but there was not. Could this have been an echo of when this place used to be a mental hospital? I, for one, think it very well could be. I've always believed in the paranormal and ghosts, but when something strange happens, I always try to debunk it first with logic. Now, I'm a believer in ghosts, but the evidence has to be something undeniable for me to finally say, yep, ghosts are real. That moment came during my systems engineer internship when I maintained equipment across ICUs in Quito's Ecuador hospitals for the company supplying their machines. The work demanded troubleshooting ventilators amid beeping alarms while inventory logs piled up. One visit stood out at the Hospital Militar. It was a stark facility where early COVID patients filled beds. They built an isolation chamber in the ICU and a sealed plastic enclosure for contagious cases connected to the main ward by a narrow passage just wide enough for one person in full PPE to squeeze through amid constant fan whir sucking air inwards. Doors used sensors requiring a full open hand waved deliberately in front of them. Individual fingers failed to trigger them, and heavy panels slid shut 10 seconds after entry, demanding the complete gesture anew to reopen from the other side. That day, nurses clustered across the room tending a struggling patient, with the monitors flashing red, while I worked inside the chamber, 4 meters away from the entrance of the door, checking ventilator calibration under strip lighting buzzing faintly overhead. Imagine my shock when the entrance panel hissed open smoothly on its own, while I stood well beyond the sensor's range with my back turned to the display screen. No motion nearby to trip it. No staff shuffling through the passage through the main ward where empty beds lined the walls. The door stayed ajar the entire time I finished diagnostics, and I packed my toolkit amid the steady whoosh of the negative pressure fans. No doctor or nurse occupied the room to wave a hand throughout. Everyone focused opposite me on that critical case. I brushed it off as a sensor glitch or faulty wiring, which was common in a rushed pandemic installation. Later I mentioned it to my nurse friend Maria, who worked that floor. She confirmed recent maintenance verified all gates perfectly with no faults logged, and her night team reported ventilators powering on solo with sudden beeps, and the laughter of children in the distance echoing from places where there were no one. They all agreed those strange occurrences surged strong right after the COVID patients started dying one by one. Feel free to share your thoughts or opinions on it. I'd love to get other perspectives. I worked night shifts as the sole on-site doctor in a small rural district general hospital, covering both medical and surgical wards while clerking admissions from the emergency department through a long corridor built into the hillside where the ED sat at ground level, but the wards descended into the cool basement spaces at the far end. One night, after a beep to the ward sent me hurrying along that dimly lit passage under the outpatient area, halfway through I felt an overwhelming stare pressing into the back of my neck with such intensity that every instinct screamed danger in the shadowed stretch ahead. I sprinted the rest of the way to the stairs instead of waiting for the lift, since that uncomfortable pressure refused to lift until the fresh air hit me upstairs, and later learned the morgue had once lined that very corridor before they relocated it years earlier, so I never walked it alone at night again. There was another night in the ED. A critically ill man from the Clinical Decisions Unit arrested and passed at around 11 p.m. after reaching end-of-life status, leaving his room silent until about 4 a.m. when I sat at the nurse's station, glancing towards his door and noticed light slowly brightening inside, as if dawn crept early through the blinds. Moments later, the door clicked open by itself, revealing not sunlight, but the red glow of emergency lighting triggered solely in that room despite power staying steady everywhere else, with no outages reported or other backup lights activated along the unit. Soon after, the electronic access doors to the department failed completely, locking everyone in place until one nurse joked we'd forgotten to open his window for a spirit to escape. So she cracked it wide, and 5 minutes later, an alarm blared from the far isolation room where nobody had gone all evening, with its negative pressure airlock meant to contain pathogens suddenly tripping because both doors stood ajar around the empty space, holding only his stored mobility scooter. Freaked us out for a good while. So I work day shifts in a hospital in the critical care unit, where I've spent the last 3 years tending to patients who are reaching the very end of their lives. I was alone in room 7 with my sedated patient. The only sounds I could hear were the very muffled chatter from the hallway and the steady breathing of my patient. As I approached the equipment cart, I witnessed something astonishing. One touchscreen button depressing itself under an unseen touch with a sharp tap ring, and the screen lit up blue beneath my gaze. I stood there frozen, wondering how such a thing could occur in this empty space. And then it occurred again, with the same button sinking silently this time to unselect whatever choice it had made before, sending chills racing down my spine so fiercely that I had to leave the room immediately. Tonight, exactly 1 week later, I walked alone down the main hallway after shift change, with my footsteps muffled slightly by thin carpet strips lining the baseboard, when a whisper sliced from directly behind me, saying, "Hey," in a voice that made me assume I overheard a co-worker trailing at a distance. I kept moving forward at first, but then I heard my own name called clearly and closer from the same spot behind my shoulder, prompting me to turn around quickly, expecting to see a familiar face from the unit, only to find the hallway utterly empty, with just dim wall lights flickering for a moment. As you can imagine, it left me profoundly freaked out. I think our hospital might be haunted. My pediatrician is a very chatty guy, and we got on fairly well. Whenever I've gone to see him with one of my kids, we usually end up chatting for a little while, usually eating into the next appointment. This was one of those times. I'd taken my kid in for the routine checkup, mostly to get them weighed and for them to make sure that they are up to date on all their vaccinations. When I look at the doctor and ask him, in a quite jovial manner, why he looks so tired, he kind of looks to the side, despite being in his own office, and goes on to say, Do you believe there's something after death?" I nod, and he goes, "Well, the thing is, I wouldn't say this to any other patient, but I was up at 3 a.m. this morning. Urgent delivery. Was called out, had to deliver the baby via C-section, don't you know. The baby didn't make it though. It was too late and numerous complications." I nodded gravely. That was a horrible thing to hear. But then he continued, "The thing is, after I'd got the baby out and helped with the mother, I was pretty much done. I was exhausted, working on about 3 hours sleep. Just as I'm helping myself to a coffee in the little room off the floor, do I hear the sound of a baby crying, coming from the operating theatre. That really freaked me out. I assumed the baby had come back to life, though I was pretty sure it wasn't alive when it was born. And I rushed out, but there was no one in there. Everyone had already been wheeled out and left that particular operating theatre. And I looked, but couldn't see any sign of any child being there. And seeing as we're nowhere near where we keep the babies, that's 2 floors down, and the room is fairly isolated, I wondered, could it have been the spirit of that baby giving its final cries before I moved on? That left me with a creepy feeling, seeing as I was in that very hospital. I never had to go to those specific floors, but it made me wonder all the same. No wonder he looked so haggard and exhausted. I guess that must play on anyone's mind. But what do you guys think? My little brother chose the worst possible timing for his arrival into this world, deciding to make his grand entrance right at the crack of dawn. I was 11 years old and already exhausted, sprawled irritably on one of those thin, blue gym mats they dragged in as makeshift cots for families waiting nearby. It's a rubbery texture sticking to my sweaty arms while the room hummed with the pre-delivery tension. I could hear the care team bustling in a stainless steel cart loaded with equipment, with the nurse announcing matter-of-factly, "We're about to break your mother's water," prompting everyone to scrub up at the deep sink basin mounted on the wall near the door, its chrome gleaming under the light while I sat up groggily on my mat, my brothers and dad positioned right behind me. To set the scene perfectly, picture those old hospital faucets with the oversized wing-shaped handles designed for quick elbow activation during busy shifts. This one had exactly that setup: large, curved levers in brushed metal labeled hot, cold, and above a deep porcelain basin splashed with lingering soap suds from prior washes. I swear on everything, as we watched the team assemble amid the rustle of sterile drapes and gloved hands snapping into place, the cold water handle began to slowly turn on its own, with a faint metallic creak, unleashing a steady stream gushing into the sink, while my jaw hit the floor alongside my brother's dad, both of us frozen in slack-jawed awe, awaiting to see what came next. Details blur slightly after all these years, but I'm fairly certain the soap dispenser beside it was the manual push-lever kind mounted low on the tiled backsplash. Next thing we knew, it depressed itself inward as if pumped by an invisible elbow, squirting a perfectly foamy dollop of pink liquid soap that splattered messily onto the wet floor below with a slippery splat. The faucet stream ran strong for another few seconds, swirling the soap into frothy edges down the drain, before the handle rotated back, counterclockwise entirely by itself, with that same deliberate creak clicking off precisely, as if someone had finished washing up and stepped away into thin air. No human figure occupied this space, yet right when the wall-mounted paper towel dispenser kicked alive, its red sensor light blinking on unprompted above the stack of folded white sheets, dispensing one crisp towel that fluttered free before something unseen ripped it loose mid-air, sending it drifting gently to the floor like a feather in a breeze. My brother's dad finally broke the stunned silence with a hoarse, "What the hell did everyone just see?" And I chimed in instantly with a wide-eyed, "Yep," only for one of the doctors or nurses to burst in and casually say, "Oh, looks like our resident ghost is pitching in to help deliver your brother." They shooed me out of the waiting area with its hard plastic chairs and vending machines just as they wheeled Mom into position, and my brother arrived healthily. I've never witnessed anything remotely like it again in all these years, but I'm endlessly grateful for those witnesses who saw the exact same thing that I did unfold. When we pressed them later, "Why so chill about the floating soap and faucet turning itself on?" they just shrugged. "Dude, it's a hospital," was their reply. Fair enough. My mum started as a lab tech at one of her first hospitals. One particular doctor there had gained a reputation among the staff for frequently barging into the lab unannounced. He would yell at the techs to hurry up with their tests no matter how backed up they were. She was still pretty new at that point, and didn't yet recognize every face among the rotating shift of doctors and specialists who came through. One day, she drew the short straw, and ended working up alone in the isolated blood bank section at the back, with nothing but liters of blood for company. She focused hard on the urgent stack of tests piled on the counter before her, each labelled slide and tube demanding precise handling amid the constant whir of centrifuges spinning in the background, when out of nowhere, she felt a prickling sensation of someone watching her intently from just a few feet away. She glanced up quickly and spotted an older bald man standing silently in the doorway, his expression calm but unreadable, with one hand tucked casually inside of his pockets of his white lab coat. My mum, being the no-nonsense kind of person who grew up in a loud Mexican household, didn't hesitate and yelled at him, "Not now, I'm busy," without breaking stride or even looking twice at him. He turned smoothly on his heels and walked out down the linoleum hallway without a word. Once she poured through the last of her work and caught her breath, she stepped out into the main lab area to ask the other techs why the doctor had poked his head in to bug her right in the middle of a rush. When she described his exact appearance, the bald head, older features, and distinct posture, with one hand tucked inside his lab coat, they all nodded knowingly and confirmed it was definitely him. Turns out, he had passed away from a heart attack months before she'd ever set foot in the building. They explained that techs often caught glimpses of him wandering the lab corridors or lingering near the blood bank, always frozen in that same signature pose, like he was still making his usual rounds to check on the progress. Some of the longer tenured staff figured he simply didn't realize he'd died and kept drifting back into his old routine out of habit. My mum still laughs about it to this day, absolutely delighted that she unknowingly told the ghost doctor to back off and let her handle her job in peace. Most people assume the scariest thing in a hospital is death itself, but they have it all wrong. Death comes quietly with a final beep on the monitor and a simple checkbox ticked off on a chart. The real terror starts with what refuses to stay dead. Things that linger in empty rooms, that move the privacy curtains when no one's there. I pulled night shifts as a nurse on 4 East, the ward everyone called the dumping ground for patients that were too unstable for regular floors, but not critical enough to warrant ICU yet. Its long hallways, lined with beeping monitors and rolling IV poles, cast jittery shadows under the dimmed overheads. That's where I met Mr. Garrow in room 412. He was a retired factory foreman with a gravelly voice and calloused hands. His constant fear of dying turned the call light into a weapon that he mashed relentlessly to keep someone stationed beside amid the drip of his sailing bag. He figured that if one of us was standing there, it would ward off the end, buying precious minutes in that narrow bed. He died anyway, on a Tuesday at exactly 3:42, flatline piercing the quiet pre-dawn hush. I zipped the heavy black body bag myself. As I knotted the toe tag around his stiffening foot, hefting the cold, dead weight onto the morgue cart with 2 orderlies, while whispering, "Goodbye, Mr. Garrow," as elevator doors slid shut with a pneumatic hiss. An old superstition drilled into new nurses is to close the door firmly on the departed. Back in room 412 for post-mortem cleanup, the space stood officially vacant, with monitors silenced and sheets stripped crisp for fresh linen. So I whipped down the vinyl mattress, slick under my disinfectant spray, coiled the call light cord neatly, clipped the remote to the chipped headboard, flicked off the light, and pulled the door shut behind me with a soft latch. Exactly 1 hour later, at 4:42, the console in our station chimed sharp through the handover chatter. Room 412, normal call. My charge nurse leaned over, face paling under the desk lamp's glare. "That's impossible. You cleared it yourself." The hallway air thickened like wading through invisible syrup, as I retraced my steps past empty rooms with doors ajar and monitors glowing standby green, pushing into 412's darkness. The call light remote lay abandoned dead in the center of the mattress, cord taut as if dragged there by something crawling low across the sheets. As I stared at the red button, it depressed itself with a deliberate click. We tried everything to see how it could have got there by itself, but there was no logical explanation. 5 minutes later, the console flared again, room 412 staff assistance. That code demands a physical body inside pressing the override button on the wall panel. It's a deliberate emergency. It cannot be a pull malfunction. Alone down that stretching hall, room 412's air hung stagnant. Reaching for the wall switch amid the headboard's chipped paint, a rasping wheeze scraped from the pitch-black bathroom beyond its half-open door. "Nurse," it croaked through the void. "You tied the tag too tight." That's when it hit. The call light wasn't broken, it was bait, and I'd walked straight into the snare. I ran out screaming, and that is what made me quit nursing. I work at a hospital which I'm not going to name for privacy reasons. It's an older facility that was once bustling with patients across multiple floors, but now mostly shuttered after a buyout left only the ER and psych ward operational, where I handle night shifts. Everyone on staff knows about our resident ghost, who we've all nicknamed Greg, a persistent presence blamed for triggering call lights in the long-abandoned patient units upstairs. He's notorious for locking doors with sharp clicks that trap staff mid-supply run, knocking charts and following people closely back, breath hot on their necks, as well as contributing to footsteps behind people, and when you whip around, there'd be no one there. Tonight marked my first personal run-in during a late 9:30 p.m. supply grab in one of those deserted units. The air was thick with disuse and faint mildew as I rummaged carts for linens and meds under a single buzzing bulb swinging faintly overhead. Footsteps approached slowly from the crisp hallway, but when I glanced up there was nothing, just dim exit signs glowing red at each end. Then a call light blared from the room directly across, red glow pulsing through its half-open door, where an empty bed frame sat stripped bare amid tangled sheets shoved to one corner. I crossed quick, silenced it with a beep, grabbed my final stack of gauze and turned for the exit, only for it to flare again, with an insistent chime cutting the quiet. "Crap, it's really Greg," I muttered to myself as I trudged back in. "Dude, cut that out, it's too late for games." Right as I reached to kill it again, the light triggered by itself mid-stride, a freaky coincidence that could pass for faulty wiring in a decaying building, but timed simply too perfectly, with the footsteps still ringing in my ears. No chills or dread hit me like how others describe. I personally feel that Greg has just reminded us that he's still about. My dad was in the ICU for heart failure. At the end, the machines were the only thing that were keeping his heart moving, so essentially we were just waiting for the doctors to call it. The hospital morgue is in the basement, and has undertakers waiting should people need their services. When it was time, the undertaker took my dad, and we went with him to sort out the paperwork. When we entered the morgue, we were led to an office space. I was very upset that there was an overwhelming smell of smoke, the kind that fills your nostrils and simply doesn't go away. I thought it was very unprofessional to smoke in an enclosed space, and a hospital to boot, but my mother and brother were unfazed, so I bit my tongue. On our way home, I complained about the smell to them, and they were very confused about what I was talking about. Now, my mum has a very, very sensitive nose, and absolutely hated the smell of smoke, particularly the smell of cigarettes, Dad would sneakily smoke before coming home, and Mum would smell it the minute he came through the door. There was no way she hadn't smelt smoke in that room. And my brother has asthma, and that kind of smoke would have sent him reeling. Yet they both hadn't smelled anything. And in hindsight, smoke that strong would have clung to clothes and hair. We were in the room for over an hour. We should have reeked. We had to go back to the office a few more times, and there was no smell of smoke on the premises, nor the people working there. I think it was Dad, having a final smoke, now that there was no one stopping him. I spent 24 to 48 hours as a patient in the hospital cardiology ward following a routine heart ablation procedure, tethered to a nest of monitoring wires snaking across my chest, and a catheter still in place that left me strictly ordered not to move even an inch from my elevated bed. Completely incapacitated, with my body locked rigidly under the thin hospital sheet, I stared at the privacy curtain drawn halfway around my bed frame, its fabric blocking any view down the dim hallway lined with the closed patient doors and flickering exit signs casting red pools on the scuffed tiles beyond. Late into the night, when the ward fell eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of machines, I heard the most horrific sound drifting closer up the hallway. A wet, gargling struggle for breath, like drowning lungs rattling with phlegm and desperation, each labored rasp dragging longer than the last, as if someone clawed for air in their final moments. The noises grew agonizingly vivid, a person choking on their own fluids with frantic wheezes and gurgles that twisted my stomach into knots while I lay helpless, straining against the wires pinching my skin and yelling mentally for help, since my voice barely carried past the curtain's edge into the apparently deserted ward where no footsteps hurried to intervene. This went on relentlessly for at least 30 minutes, the death rattle wandering slowly past my room, with wet hacks echoing off the high ceiling before fading down the corridor towards the nurse's station, leaving only ringing silence while I craned my neck uselessly against the pillow, desperate to glimpse a struggling figure stumbling through the shadows. Finally, a nurse bustled in with her cart, rattling softly over the threshold, clipboard in hand, and stethoscope draped around her neck as she checked my vitals. Heart still pounding from the ordeal, I blurted out urgently that they needed to rush and check on the patient down the hall, who sounded like they were dying right that second, drowning in their own throat. She paused, with the blood pressure cuff halfway around my arm. Her expression was calm, but eyes widening slightly, then replied in a matter-of-fact tone that I was currently the only patient admitted to the entire heart ward that night, and no one else could access the secure double doors without a staff badge swipe. So what the hell was I hearing? My family visited my wife's cousin in a northern Peninsular Malaysia hospital maternity ward. It was a 6-bed room. 5 beds held new mothers propped on pillows with flowers waiting on 9 stands, loved ones clustered around, and plastic chairs had been dragged from the hallway. You could hear voices overlapping in warm chatter. My cousin occupied the middle bed, smiling through fatigue with her newborn bundle nearby, while the end bed nearest the window bustled with visitors too. It was a grandmother fanning herself with a newspaper. Opposite that occupied bed sat the lone empty one, and amid the lively talk of names and first cries, a young girl no older than 7 perched on a stool by the last bed and suddenly burst out sharp, "Leave my auntie alone," jabbing a small finger towards a spot hovering just above the vacant mattress. Everyone swiveled towards the outburst, conversation dying as her mother knelt swiftly beside the stool, voice calm and curious. "Who are you talking to, honey?" The girl pointed firmly at the empty airspace. "Him! What exactly is he doing?" Her mother pressed gently, hand resting lightly on the girl's knee. "He's pulling faces at her." The child insisted, eyes locked on nothing visible to the adults. Her mother nodded, unfazed. "That's okay. He won't bother anyone. Come, let's grab a drink." And she guided the girl out, hand in hand towards the vending machines, humming by the nurse's station, leaving everyone whispering and exchanging glances in regards to whatever the hell that was. Later questions revealed that that wing in the hospital is part of the oldest structure, its concrete walls scarred from decades of expansions, and it had a reputation for hauntings. Kids really do see what we miss. I figured the mother's total calm while reacting like that meant that this was not the first time it happened. Okay, so this is the weirdest, unexplained thing that has ever happened to me. I don't know if it's paranormal, but I definitely can't explain it. Let me give you some background that's important to this story. This story takes place in 2012, in my elementary school that has since been torn down and rebuilt. The school at the time was built off a really old building that had been used as a hospital in the early 1900s. The basement of the hospital is now used partially as a storage room and part of the special education room. I had an IEP, individual educational program, and my 6th grade teacher would allow me and my friends who also had it to go down there and get my work done sometimes. Anyway, now to the main story. So on this day, a close friend and another classmate and I were assigned a group project together. Our teacher said it was fine if we wanted to go and work in the basement and get some focus. We mainly liked to break off and work down there so we could mess around and avoid doing work, ironically enough. So we were excited to spend the last period of the day goofing off and getting some light work done before we got to go home. We took our supplies and went down to the basement, set up a desk and started chatting. We were probably down there for about 30 minutes already before we realized we should probably start to wrap up and head back to class. As we packed up to go, a man walked down the stairs that we had never seen before. He was dressed in a dark blue jumpsuit type outfit. He looked like a bit of a stereotypical janitor. He was white and around 6 feet tall with dark grey hair. He looked pretty weathered, and his outfit a little dirty too. He was probably in his 50s if I had to guess. So when we saw him, we assumed he was the custodian or something based on how he was dressed, and smiled and said hello. Now the details on how this conversation began are a little fuzzy, but how I remember, it was as we went to walk past him to leave that he asked if we believed in ghosts. Now my friend and I were obsessed with the paranormal at the time, so we were definitely intrigued about an adult asking us about it. So she and I said yes, while my other classmate said she wasn't sure, and then looked at us and said, "I can tell you have a good soul by your aura," and proceeded to describe each of our aura colors and what they meant. My good friend, who was also into the paranormal, was really chatting and engaging with the man about what he was saying. My classmate definitely seemed intrigued, but was a little more hesitant to speak. I, on the other hand, couldn't help but feel like something was off about the situation. The guy honestly seemed a little nuts, and went on to talk about his wife and how she was able to fly around the world using astral projection. I honestly had never heard of these kind of things before. We probably stood there talking to him for a good 10 to 15 minutes before the bell rang, and we realized we needed to get back to class. We thanked him for sharing his spiritual wisdom with us and left. My friend was all excited, talking about how cool the guy was. I thought it was interesting, but because of my weird feeling about it, I wanted to talk to our teacher about it. So when we got to class, we told her what happened in the basement and what the guy had told us. Let's just say she had a logical reaction of being confused and concerned about this strange situation. She told us to go talk to the school secretary and asked if there are any substitute janitors working today, since none of us recognized him. So she went off to the secretary's office and told her the same story and asked her if she knew who the guy was. She looked shocked and said she had no idea, and not to freak us out, but said she'd look into it. I could tell based on her reaction that no one with that description could have been in the school that day. Shortly after, that school adopted stricter check-in policies and more security. So I'm not sure if that encounter was the cause, but I'm sure it was an influence. My takeaway after discussing and thinking over the situation years later is that it definitely could have been a weird guy that just broke into the school and left without anyone noticing. Or perhaps it was the spirit of an old hospital worker, since the outfit we thought was a janitor's outfit could have been hospital scrubs or something. Honestly, I'm not sure who the guy was, or why he decided to chat to 3 young girls about ghosts randomly. But it remained one of the weirdest things that has ever happened to me. Another thing to note, of why I'm not sure if it was paranormal or not, is that the basement was really creepy and always felt a little off. Other kids said they saw or heard things down there, but again, it could all just be kids' imaginations. I've had other paranormal things happen in my life, but this is the one situation that was so clear, and all 3 of us agreed on what we experienced. I work in a small, pre-op surgical ward tucked into the older wing of our medical center. We only have 10 beds, 2 with actual doors, and the rest are separated by curtains. All of our bedside monitors feed into the main screen at our station. It's supposed to help us keep track of vitals from a distance. But instead, it shows us things that should not exist. We'll get blood pressure spikes from beds that haven't been occupied all day. Oxygen readings will blink on from completely empty bays, and every so often one of the IV poles glides across an open room on its own. More than one patient has asked to leave early after seeing it happen. Right across from our desk is the room we used for confused patients, dementia cases, or people with high risk of falling. Basically, the ones we really needed to watch constantly. 2 years ago, a fire started in there. It scorched one corner of the walls in a pattern that looks almost like fingers dragging upwards. Maintenance painted over it, but the shape still bleeds through the layers if you look long enough. That room gets the worst of it. Patients will beg us to move them somewhere else. They swear someone stands behind the curtain even when it's wide open. Others describe seeing faces pressed against the ceiling tiles, watching them sleep. One elderly man kept pointing at the corner and whispering that the tall thing was waiting for the lights to go out. We used to keep a wooden crucifix above the sink, mostly because families felt better with something comforting on the wall. One morning we walked in and found it shattered, the body gone. We eventually located it. The head of the figure had been driven straight into the ceiling panel, like someone hurled it with force far beyond a human's. And yet no alarm had gone off, and no one had entered the room, and the cameras had only caught static. We've had clergy come through multiple times to bless the ward, and in that room in particular, they always stay longer than they've planned. One of them refused to step in more than a few feet, saying it felt cursed. No matter how clean and bright the staff tries to keep it, the place feels like it remembers tragedy. Like someone is inside and refuses to let go. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I do hope you have enjoyed tonight's collection of scary stories. Just goes to show hospitals are terrifying places for more reasons than one would like to admit, especially me. I would like to give an extra special thank you to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen for their continued support of the channel. And if you would like to help me out by supporting me financially, or just by checking in on the free content that I post there every week, feel free to follow the link over to Patreon. But that's it from me. Stay awesome, guys, and I will see you tomorrow as we wrap up Ghost Week with a chilling collection of paranormal stories. Until next time, guys, good night.